Victor Rourke dropped the contract on the table like it was already signed. He didn't knock. He didn't wait. He walked into Caleb Mercer's study, pulled out a chair that wasn't offered to him, and sat down with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no. The papers landed with a slap-thick official looking, bound with a ribbon that had no business being on something so rotten at its core. He smiled across the desk at Caleb and said, "Sign tonight. By morning you'll have cash in hand and a partner who knows how to protect what you've built." What he didn't say, what he never said, was that buried in paragraph 11, subsection C, in language so dense it would take a lawyer 3 readings to untangle, those papers would hand him control of every drop of water that crossed Caleb Mercer's land the moment a drought hit. And droughts always hit. If you were sitting across that table, would you have seen it coming? If this kind of story keeps you awake at night, if you know what it feels like to watch something precious get taken by some who smiled while they took it, then this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single chapter. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning Elena Hart arrived at the Mercer Ranch, it was raining in the way Montana rains in early April, not hard enough to be dramatic, just steady and cold and indifferent, the kind of rain that soaks through wool before you realize it's happening. She came in on the supply wagon from Billings, sitting up on the bench beside the driver with a canvas bag between her feet and a leather satchel across her lap that she kept one hand on the entire ride, even when the road turned rough enough to rattle her teeth. The driver, a heavy-set man named Pruitt who smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, had talked for most of the 2 hours. Elena had answered in single words when she answered at all. Not because she was unfriendly, but because she'd learned, after years of arriving in new places as hired help, that listening was more useful than talking. People told you more when they thought you weren't paying attention. Pruitt told her plenty. Caleb Mercer, she learned, had run the ranch alone for 4 years. His wife had died in childbirth. The baby hadn't made it either. Since then, Mercer had worked the land with the focused fury of a man trying to outrun something up before dawn in the saddle by first light, back after dark. He'd expanded the herd, acquired 2 adjacent parcels, and built the kind of reputation in the territory that meant other ranchers tipped their hats, and bankers returned his letters. He'd also, according to Pruitt, let his household go to pieces. Last woman who cooked for him quit in January, Pruitt said, guiding the horses around a deep rut in the road. Before that, he had a couple of the handswives doing shifts. That fell apart, too. Man doesn't notice what he eats, doesn't care what his house looks like. Lives like he's camping in his own property. Elena looked out at the flat gray landscape. What happened with the previous arrangement? The cooks and the wives? Pruitt shrugged. He's not mean about it, just absent. You do a thing and he doesn't see it. You put effort in and it lands nowhere. Women don't stay long when they feel like furniture. She stored that away. The wagon came around a long bend in the road, and the Mercer Ranch appeared through the rain, a main house built from pine and riverstone, 2 stories, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and one side. Behind it, the barn, the bunkhouse, the equipment sheds, the corrals. The scale of it was larger than she'd expected. The state of it was exactly what she'd been warned about. The porch boards were warped. One shutter hung at an angle from a single hinge. The kitchen garden that must have once been productive was now a rectangle of dead stalks and mud. The curtains in the downstairs windows were the wrong weight for the season-heavy winter fabric, still in place, though it was nearly spring. Small things, each of them. But small things added up, and what they added up to here was a house that had stopped being tended to years ago, not out of poverty but out of something else. Pruitt pulled up near the front steps, and Elena climbed down before he had the horses fully stopped. She was halfway up the porch steps when the door opened. Caleb Mercer was taller than she'd pictured him, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that came from years of actual physical work rather than supervising it. He was probably 40, though he looked older around the eyes. He was wearing a collared shirt that hadn't been ironed recently, and trousers with a crease that had given up. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had agreed to something he wasn't sure about. "Miss Hart." "It wasn't a question, Mr. Mercer." She stopped 2 steps below him and met his eyes directly. She'd found over the years that hired help who avoided eye contact got treated accordingly. "I understand you need a cook and a housekeeper. I do both, and I do them well. I'll need to see the kitchen before we discuss terms." Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, more like mild surprise that she hadn't led with pleasantries. "Suit yourself," he said, and stepped aside. The kitchen was worse than the outside suggested. Not filthy, whoever had been managing it last had at least kept the surfaces wiped down, but disorganized in the way that happens when a room has had too many temporary stewards and no permanent one. The pantry shelves were half-stocked in a pattern that made no sense. Items mixed without logic. staples running low while luxury goods sat untouched. The stove needed its flue cleaned. 2 of the burner grates were cracked. The window over the sink let in a draft that would make it miserable to stand there in winter, and someone had stuffed a rag into the gap as a solution. Elena walked the room slowly, opening the pantry, checking the cold storage, lifting the lid on the flour bin. She didn't say anything for a while. Mercer stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Well," he said finally, "the stove grates need replacing. I'll want a list of what you have an account with at the general store in town. The pantry needs reorganizing and some specific items restocked. The window seal needs proper repair, not that rag." She turned to face him. "What are your preferences for meals?" He blinked. "Preferences. Food you can't eat. Food you won't eat. Things you've requested before that didn't get done the way you wanted." He was quiet for a moment. "I eat what's put in front of me." "That's not an answer, Mr. Mercer. That's what a man says when he's given up expecting anything. I'm asking what you actually like." Another pause. "Longer this time. My mother made venison stew with dried apples. Haven't had it in years." Elena nodded, filed that away too. "I'll need a couple of days to get the kitchen in order before I can cook properly. In the meantime, I can manage simple meals with what you have. Terms: I get the room I was promised, access to the kitchen garden even if it needs work, and Sundays off after the midday meal." Mercer looked at her like she was a horse he wasn't sure about buying. "You have references?" She handed him a folded paper from the satchel. He read it, folded it back, handed it over without comment. "Fine," he said. "Foreman's name is Dale Hutchins. He'll show you around the rest of the property." He left without another word. Elena stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the rags stuffed in the window gap. Then she pulled it out, examined the gap, and went to find the toolbox she'd spotted under the stairs. Dale Hutchins was a short, bow-legged man in his late 50s who chewed tobacco and had the watchful eyes of someone who'd spent decades reading weather and people with equal care. He showed Elena the bunkhouse, the smokehouse, the well, the root cellar, and the state of the kitchen garden with a running commentary that was more useful than anything Pruitt had said. 7 hands on payroll right now," he told her as they walked the fence line of the garden. 2 of them been here since before Mrs. Mercer passed. The others rotated through. "We eat in the bunkhouse mostly. There's a camp stove in there. Whatever comes out of the main kitchen, the boss eats alone." "He eat with the hands at all?" Hutchins gave a short laugh that wasn't quite humorous. "Not in 3 years." She looked at the garden. "What was here before?" "Everything." Mrs. Mercer kept a serious garden. Herbs, greens, roots, squash, beans. She dried things and canned things, and the kitchen smelled like something worth coming in from the cold. For he paused, the chewing stopping for a moment. "Boss pulled everything himself the autumn after she died. Said it had gone to seed. I don't think that was really why." Elena looked at the dead stalks. Some of them were the remains of perennials. The root systems might still be viable if the soil had been left alone. "You know you're telling me all this?" she asked. Hutchins gave her a sideways look. He didn't say not to. She spent the rest of that first afternoon in the kitchen, not cooking but organizing, pulling everything out of the pantry and putting it back in an order that reflected how a kitchen actually worked, rather than how items happened to be shoved onto shelves. She took an inventory and wrote a list. She found 2 cast-iron skillets that hadn't been seasoned properly and left them on the stove to deal with later. She discovered behind a bin of dried beans a small tin of imported coffee that had been there long enough that the lid had rusted slightly at the edge. She pried it open carefully. Still good. She made coffee. She was at the table with a cup and her notebook when Mercer came in around 6. He stopped when he smelled it. She didn't look up from her notes. Cups on the stove. She heard him pour. Heard him sit down at the far end of the table. She kept writing. "What's that?" he said after a while. "Inventory and a list of what I need from town. I'll have it ready for whoever makes the next supply run." Silence. Then that coffee was under the beans.
"Yes."
"I didn't know it was there. Someone put it there a while ago." It kept. Another silence, different from the first. Softness around the edges. "It's good," he said. "It's just coffee, Mr. Mercer." She heard something that might have been the beginning of a response, then wasn't. When she finally looked up, he was staring at the table, the cup in both hands, looking like a man who'd forgotten how to sit still in his own house. She went back to her notes. By the 3rd day, she had the kitchen running. Not perfectly. The stove grate was still cracked, and she was working around it, but functionally, in the way a kitchen runs when someone who understands food is managing it. She'd found the start of the herb garden under the dead stalks, a rosemary bush that had survived the winter, several thyme plants, the beginnings of chives pushing up at the edge near the south fence. She'd turned the soil in 2 of the beds and planted from the seed stock she'd found in the cold storage. She'd roasted a chicken for dinner with herbs she'd salvaged, and served it with the dried applesauce she'd worked out from what she had, which was not the venison stew she'd promised, but was a reasonable signal of intent. Mercer ate all of it. He didn't say so, but his plate was clean. The hands were less complicated. They were hungry men who did physical labor all day, and they cared about quantity and reliability. She made large pots of things: beans and salt pork, fried cornbread, roasted root vegetables, whatever the smokehouse provided, and sent it over to the bunkhouse in the iron pots at 6 o'clock. Within 2 days, she had the bunkhouse crew saying good morning to her when she came out to the well, which was more than they'd apparently offered the last 3 cooks. Hutchins mentioned it in passing. "You're not invisible to 'em." "I'm not trying to be." Last 2 cooks kept to themselves. Thought the hands were rough. "They're working men," Elena said. "They're not rough, they're tired." She was also, by the 4th day, keeping her ears open. She'd learned early in her years of moving from household to household that kitchens were where people talked. Not at her. Usually she was hired help. And hired help was furniture, as Pruitt had said. But around her, people forgot you were listening when you were stirring a pot or kneading dough. They talked to each other as if the woman at the stove wasn't taking in every word. She learned that the ranch hands were uneasy about something, though the specifics were vague. Something about water. Something about a man who'd come out from Helena twice in the past month. She learned that 2 of the younger hands had overheard a conversation between Mercer and that man that had left them looking at each other in the bunkhouse that night. She learned that Hutchins had his own thoughts about it, but kept them to himself. She filed all of it away. On the 5th day, the man from Helena came back. She heard him arrive from the kitchen, the sound of a good horse, better than ranch stock, moving up the path at a pace that suggested its rider was comfortable making people wait for him. She glanced out the window over the sink. A man in his mid-40s, dressed well for the territory in a dark coat and a hat that hadn't been sat on. He had a case under one arm. He went inside without knocking. Elena kept working. She was starting a soup and had onions to get through, but she slowed her pace deliberately and stayed near the door to the hallway, which she'd left open for air. She could hear the study from there, not the words, but the tones. The visitor's voice was smooth and unhurried, the kind of practiced ease that came from years of talking people into things. Mercer's responses were shorter, clipped. 20 minutes later, she heard the study door open. She moved back to the stove. Mercer appeared in the kitchen doorway a minute after that. He looked like a man who'd been handed something heavy and was trying to decide where to put it down. "That was Victor Rourke," he said. Elena stirred the pot. "The man who's been out twice before?" He looked at her. "Hutchins told you the hands talk." She reached for the salt. "What does he want?" Mercer leaned against the doorframe. He seemed to be working something out, and she let him work it. "He's put together a partnership arrangement. Water rights, basically. He's got backing from some investors in the East who want to develop irrigation infrastructure in the territory. He says partnering with the ranches that have established water rights would protect them, give them capital and legal backing if there are disputes over water during a drought." Elena kept her face neutral. "And he's asking you to sign something." He left papers. "Have you had anyone look at them?" "Not yet." She put the spoon down. "Mr. Mercer, may I see them?" He frowned. Not offended exactly, more like he wasn't sure what category to put the request in. "You want to look at a water rights contract?" "I want to look at the papers a man like that leaves behind after a second visit." He studied her for a moment. Then he went to the study and came back with a sheaf of papers, maybe 20 pages, dense with legal language, bound with the red ribbon she'd seen through the window. She sat down at the kitchen table and read. She read the way she always read documents, slowly, systematically, moving her lips slightly on the difficult passages. Not from confusion, but from concentration, making sure every clause landed. Mercer sat across from her and drank coffee and said nothing, which she appreciated. It took her 25 minutes to get through it once. Then she turned back to page 8 and read a specific section again. Then she looked up. "There's a provision here," she said, keeping her voice even, in the subsection about drought conditions. "If a defined drought event occurs, and they define it specifically on page 14, and if water usage on your land falls below a certain threshold during that period, the contract allows Rourke's entity to assume what they call operational management of your water access points." She paused. "That means the wells, the creek that crosses your east parcel, the reservoir by the north pasture." Mercer went still. "That's not a partnership," Elena said. "That's a transfer of control dressed up in the language of protection." The color in Mercer's face changed. "He told me the drought provision was a safety mechanism, something to ensure the water got used efficiently if there was a shortage. He told you what the provision does in a way that sounds like something you'd want. That's not the same as telling you what it actually does." Mercer picked up the papers. He turned to page 8, found the section. "Read it." His jaw tightened. "I was going to have Edmund look at it this week," he said. "You should have him look at it tomorrow," Elena said. "At the latest." He set the papers down. looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not quite suspicion, not quite gratitude, somewhere uncomfortable in between. How do you know how to read something like this? She picked up the spoon and went back to the soup, because someone who didn't know how to read it lost everything he had, and I watched it happen. She didn't say anything more, and after a moment, Mercer took the papers back to the study. She stood at the stove and stirred, and didn't let herself think about Nebraska, or the house that wasn't theirs anymore, or her father's face the morning he finally understood what he'd signed. Not yet, there was soup to finish. Edmund Vale came out 2 days later. He was a thin man with a gray beard kept trimmed, with the precision of someone who believed small disciplines were the foundation of larger ones. He'd been practicing territorial law for 15 years and had the careful eyes of a man who read contracts the way other men read weather. Mercer had sent him a message the previous morning, and Vale had written out the same day he received it, which told Elena something about either his character or his relationship with Mercer, or both. She made coffee and left it in the study. She did not sit in on the meeting. What she did do was stay in the kitchen with the door open, moving as quietly as she could, not pretending she wasn't listening. The conversation went on for an hour and a half. At one point, Vale's voice rose enough that she caught complete sentences. This clause here, Caleb. This is not ambiguous. This is deliberately written to obscure what it does. At another point, Mercer's voice, lower, tighter. Why would he think I wouldn't have this examined? And Vale again, quieter, more deliberate, because most men don't. Because most men trust the presentation more than the document. Because that's how this works. When the study door opened and the two men came down the hall toward the kitchen, Elena was at the stove, turning chicken pieces in a skillet, her back to the door. She didn't turn around. Miss Hart, Mercer said. She turned then. Vale was looking at her with an expression that was either curiosity or assessment, maybe both. Edmund Vale, he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who was used to shaking hands with people regardless of what they did for a living. She found it before I called you, Mercer said to Vale. Not proudly, not resentfully, just as a statement of fact. Vale looked at her steadily. Which clause? Page 8, subsection C. The drought condition language that converts operational management of water access to the partnering entity. Did you read the page 14 definitions? Yes. The drought threshold is set low enough to trigger in a moderate shortage, not just a severe one. Vale was quiet for a moment. How did you know to look for that kind of structure? She thought about how to answer that. I've seen it before, she said. Different document, different territory. Same mechanism. Vale looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at her. She turned back to the skillet. I'd like to hear about that, Vale said quietly to her back. Tonight, if Mr. Mercer doesn't need me for anything else, she said. After supper, she told them at the kitchen table, with the oil lamp burning low and the chicken long cleared away. She was 29 years old. She had been 17 when her family lost the homestead. She did not dress the story up. She gave them the facts in the order they happened, because that was how they lived in her memory in sequence, each one following unavoidably from the last. Her father, Thomas Hart, had homesteaded in Nebraska when Elena was 4. He was not an uneducated man, but he was a farmer, and he trusted people who wore good coats and carried official papers and spoke with the confidence of those who knew things he didn't. When a man named Gideon Voss came to him with a water rights arrangement framed, as these things always were, as protection against larger ranching interests that wanted to push out the small farms her father signed. He signed because the man was persuasive. He signed because the document looked official. He signed because the clause that would eventually take everything from him was buried in language that required a legal education to decode. And Thomas Hart didn't have one. The drought came in her father's 52nd year. Elena was 17. The clause triggered. Within 8 months, the family had been forced off the land through a combination of legal pressure, debt leverage, and the kind of sustained official harassment that was designed to exhaust rather than defeat outright. They moved to a cousin's property in Iowa. Her father worked other men's fields for the last 12 years of his life. He died without ever recovering what he'd lost. She said all of this plainly. She didn't reach for emotion. The facts were heavy enough on their own, Vossvale said when she finished. Gideon Voss. He operated out of Omaha. I don't know if he's still active. Vale and Mercer exchanged a look she caught but didn't comment on. After my father lost the land, Elena continued, I spent every spare hour I had for the next several years learning to read legal documents. I found a retired attorney in Iowa who let me sit in his office and read case files in exchange for keeping the place clean. I read everything I could find on land grants, water rights, property conveyances, easements. She paused. I couldn't undo what happened to my father, but I told myself that if I ever saw that structure again, I would know it. The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind had picked up. You knew it, Mercer said. I knew it the second time through page 8. Vale leaned back in his chair. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the ceiling, thinking, the structure you're describing, the drought-triggered management transfer, that's a specific mechanism. Legally sophisticated. Not something most local operators would construct on their own. No, Elena agreed. Which suggests either Rourke has very good attorneys or he has a template he's working from. Vale looked at her now. Or both. She held his gaze. Or he learned it from someone who's been running the same scheme in other territories. The word someone sat in the air between them. Vale said carefully, "Do you think Rourke and Voss are connected?" She looked at the lamp. "I think I would like to know the answer to that question before Rourke comes back for the signature." The following morning she found the bunkhouse door open at first light, and 3 of the hands standing outside it in the cold, looking at something on the ground. She crossed the yard and pushed through until she could see. It was a dead coyote, placed deliberately, not fallen there. Placed, head toward the bunkhouse door, a small piece of folded paper tucked under one foreleg. Hutchins picked up the paper. He read it, his expression not changing in any way she'd learned to read, which meant something she couldn't interpret yet. He handed it to her. It wasn't addressed to anyone. 3 sentences. Plain handwriting, no flourishes. Water comes from somewhere. Wise men remember who controls the source. Some arrangements are better accepted than refused. She read it twice, handed it back to Hutchins. "Rourke?" she said. Or someone he sent. She stood there looking at the coyote for a moment. "Who found it?" "Billy, coming out at 6. He meant the youngest hand, barely 19. He's fine, spooked but fine. Should Mr. Mercer see this?" "Already sent someone up to the house." She turned back toward the kitchen. There was breakfast to make, and she needed to think, and she thought best when her hands were occupied. She was cracking eggs when she heard Mercer's boots on the porch. He came through the kitchen without stopping, went out the back door. She heard his voice outside, low and even, not raised. She heard Hutchins. She heard the particular quality of silence that falls when men are making decisions rather than having conversations. Mercer came back in after 10 minutes. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "I'm sending a message to Edmund this morning," he said. "I want to know everything there is to know about Victor Rourke before he comes back here." She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. "And when he comes back." Mercer's expression was hard to read. There was anger in it, but it was controlled anger, the kind that doesn't burn out fast. "He'll get his answer." She turned back to the eggs. "He'll push back. I expect he will. It may get worse than a coyote and a note." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "I know." "Are you prepared for that?" Another pause, longer. "Are you?" She cracked the last egg and didn't flinch. "I've been prepared for it for 12 years, she said. "I just didn't have a case worth preparing for." She felt him watching her back for a moment. Then he went to pour himself coffee, and she cooked, and neither of them said anything more. But something had shifted in the room, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say that either. Outside, the morning came on gray and cold across the Montana flats, and somewhere in Helena, Victor Rourke was having his own breakfast and waiting for a signature that was not going to come. He didn't know that yet. He would find out soon enough. And when he did, Elena Hart was going to be standing on the right side of the room when he did. Edmund Vale rode back out to the Mercer ranch 3 days after Mercer sent for him, and this time he brought a saddlebag full of papers. Elena heard the horse in the yard while she was working bread dough at the kitchen table, and she listened to the sounds of arrival, the dismount, the exchange of words with whoever was in the yard, the boots on the porch steps, and kept working. She had learned not to stop what she was doing every time something happened. That was how you lost a day. Vale came through to the kitchen before going to the study, which surprised her. He set his hat on the table and accepted the cup she poured without being asked. And he stood rather than sat, which told her he'd been writing long enough that sitting felt wrong. "I found some things," he said. She punched the dough down and turned it. "About Rourke. About the structure. The legal structure of the contract." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "In the last 2 years, there have been 4 property disputes in the territory involving water rights. 3 of them were settled outside court. 1 of them went before a judge, and the landowner lost." He paused. "In all 4 cases, the original agreement had the same drought trigger mechanism your father's contract had." She kept her hands moving. "Same language?" "Close enough that it had to come from the same template. Different words in places, same effect." He drank. "The man who brought the agreements to 3 of the 4 properties was Victor Rourke." She stopped kneading. She hadn't meant to, but she stopped. "And the 4th? Vale looked at her steadily. "The 4th was a man named Harlan Price, working out of the same Helena office address that Rourke uses." She turned the dough over and covered it with a cloth. Her hands were steady. She was concentrating on keeping them that way. "Did you find anything connecting Rourke to Gideon Voss?" "Not directly, not yet." Vale set his cup down. But Miss Hart, the mechanism you described from your father's contract in Nebraska, I had a colleague in Omaha send me a summary of the Voss case files from that period. The drought trigger structure in Voss's contracts and the one in Rourke's contract for this ranch are functionally identical. The phrasing is different. The architecture is the same. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. They're connected, she said. I believe so. I can't prove it yet. What do you need to prove it? Corporate records if any entity connects them. Correspondence if I can get access to it. Testimony from the families that were affected. He paused. And someone who understands both sets of contracts well enough to explain to a judge exactly how they work. In plain terms, she understood what he was not quite asking. I'll testify if it comes to that. He looked at her in the way he'd looked at her that first evening, like a man recalibrating something. You understand what that means. Rourke will have attorneys who will try to discredit you. They'll point out that you have no legal training. They'll point out your personal connection to the Voss case. I know it will not be comfortable, Mr. Vale, she said. Almost nothing in my life has been comfortable. That's not a complaint. I'm just telling you that comfort is not the measure I use when I decide whether to do something. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his hat. Mercer's waiting for me in the study. I'll need another hour with him. If you have time this evening, I'd like to sit with both of you and go through what I found. I'll have supper ready at 6, she said. You're welcome at the table. He nodded and went down the hall. She stood alone in the kitchen and looked at the covered dough rising slowly under the cloth, and she thought about her father's hands, the way they'd looked when he finally understood what he'd lost. Large hands, cracked from work, holding the papers that had taken everything, turning them over as if a different angle might make the words mean something different. They hadn't. She turned to the stove and started on the soup. Supper that evening was the three of them at the kitchen table. Mercer, Vale, and Elena, with the papers spread at the end nearest the lamp, and the food pushed to the middle. It was the kind of meal where people ate mechanically, attention elsewhere, which meant Elena could watch both men without appearing to. Mercer listened to Vale's findings with the stillness of someone who has learned to process anger slowly. He asked questions that were direct and specific, not the questions of a man panicking, but of a man building a picture. How many ranches had been affected? What happened to the families who'd signed before the drought provision triggered? Whether Rourke had approached anyone else in the county that Vale knew of. Vale answered each question carefully. When he got to the part about the Omaha connection, the matching structure between Voss's old contracts and Rourke's, Mercer looked at Elena. You knew they were connected, he said. I suspected. That's not the same as knowing. You suspected from the first time you read that contract. She considered being modest about it and decided against it. Yes, Mercer looked back at Vale. What do we do? Vale sorted through his papers. He had a methodical way of handling documents, not slow but deliberate, each paper placed where it could be found again. We have several tracks to pursue simultaneously. First, I need to file a formal objection to the contract with the Territorial Land Office before Rourke can take any action based on the assumption of agreement. That's protective, and it needs to happen in the next week. He looked at Mercer. Second, I want to examine the corporate registration for Rourke's entity, whatever legal vehicle he's using for these transactions. If Voss is connected, his name or the names of his associates should appear somewhere in those records. How do you get those records? Elena asked. They're public, technically. Corporate registrations filed with the territory. It's a matter of knowing where to look and being willing to dig. Vale paused. The third track is more complicated. The families who lost land or water rights in those 4 previous cases, I'd like to make contact with them. If any of them are willing to speak to what happened, that changes this from a single contract dispute to a pattern of fraud. Mercer's jaw shifted. How long does this take? Weeks, possibly months if it goes before a judge. And Rourke comes back in. Mercer looked at Elena. He said he'd expect an answer within a fortnight, she said. That was 8 days ago. Vale nodded. Then we need to be moving now. Mercer looked at the table for a moment, the letter he left. The note with the coyote, is that usable? It could be. It depends on whether a judge reads it as a threat or as an ambiguous warning. I'd rather have more concrete evidence of pattern before I rely on that alone. Vale glanced at Elena. Tell me more about what you remember from the Voss case. Not your family situation specifically, I mean his methods. How he approached families. Whether he worked alone or through representatives. Elena put her fork down. He worked through representatives almost exclusively. I don't think my father ever met Voss directly. The man who came to our door was younger, polished, very good at making you feel that signing was the sensible and safe thing to do, that not signing was the choice of someone who didn't understand how the territory worked. She paused. Rourke is older than that man was, but the presentation is the same. The tone. The way he frames refusal as naivety rather than caution. Vale was writing notes. He wrote quickly in a small, precise hand. Did the representative ever come back after your father signed? He asked. Once, about a year later. Not the same man, a different one. He came to explain what the drought provision meant for that season. Elena looked at the lamp. That was when my father finally understood what he'd done. What did he do when he understood? He went to a lawyer in the nearest town. The lawyer told him the contract was valid and there was nothing to be done. She paused. That lawyer had also done work for Voss's operation. We didn't know that until afterward. Mercer looked up sharply. You think Rourke has people like that here? She met his eyes. I think a man who's been running this scheme across multiple territories for more than a decade understands that you need more than legal documents. You need the right people in the right offices, willing to look in the right direction at the right time. The lamp threw long shadows across the papers. Vale had stopped writing and was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before, on the retired attorney in Iowa who'd let her read his files, a look that wasn't quite sympathy, but was a kind of recognition. Miss Hart, he said, have you considered that your knowledge of how this scheme operates might be more valuable to this case than you understand? She had considered it. She'd been considering it since the moment she recognized the clause on page 8. Yes. Then I want you involved, not as hired help. As someone who understands this better than most people who've spent years studying the law. He looked at Mercer, if that's acceptable to you. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in his face that she couldn't quite read, not discomfort, but something more internal than that. Something that had to do with recalibrating what he thought he'd hired versus what was actually sitting at his table. It's her decision, he said. She looked back at Vale. Tell me what you need me to do. The next morning, Elena woke before the house did and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with a candle and the notes she'd been keeping since her first week at the ranch. She'd developed the habit years ago, not a diary, nothing personal, just observations. Dates, names, things she'd noticed, patterns in behavior or supply or routine that might matter later. Most of the time they didn't. Sometimes they did. She turned to a fresh page and began writing out everything she could remember about the structure of Voss's contracts from the documents she'd studied in Iowa. Not the specific language. She'd been 17 when she last read those documents, and her memory of the precise wording had blurred over time, but the architecture, the sequence of provisions, which clauses depended on which others, where the dangerous language was consistently hidden. She wrote for an hour before she heard anyone else moving in the house. Mercer came down before full light, the way he always did. She heard him stop in the hall when he saw the candle, and then he came in and poured himself coffee without saying anything. He stood at the window and looked out at the dark yard. You sleep, he said after a while. He turned from the window. He looked tired in the way that comes not from one bad night, but from a long stretch of them, a tiredness that has settled into a person's posture and the way they hold their mouth. I keep thinking about those other families, the ones Rourke already got to. She kept writing. Vale's going to contact them, I know. He sat down at the far end of the table, not across from her, but at the corner closer than he usually sat, though she wasn't sure he'd noticed that. It's not just anger. It's I should have read it more carefully. He came here twice before you arrived, and I sat across from him and let him talk, and I didn't question enough. She looked up. You were about to have it examined by an attorney. That's what you do with contracts you're not sure about. But I wasn't suspicious enough to read it myself first. Most people aren't. That's how the scheme works. It relies on trust, and on the assumption that official-looking documents are what they appear to be. She held his gaze. You're not foolish, Mr. Mercer. You're someone who hadn't encountered this particular kind of deception before. He was quiet for a moment. You had, I had. How old were you when you started reading legal documents? 17. First one I read was the contract that took my father's land. She looked back at her notes. I couldn't do anything with it then, but I understood it. That's a terrible way to start learning something. Yes, she said simply. It was. He didn't say anything else for a while. She wrote. He drank his coffee. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the horizon. Eventually, one of the hands crossed the yard toward the barn, and Mercer stood and took his cup to the sink. I'm going to ride the east fence line this morning, he said. The creek that crosses the north pasture, I want to see the state of the access points Rourke's contract would have controlled. She nodded. Breakfast in half an hour. He pulled on his coat and went out. She watched him cross the yard in the early gray light, a large man moving with deliberate purpose, and she thought about what it cost a person to admit, even quietly and to themselves, that they'd nearly been taken for everything they'd spent a life building. It cost something real. She knew the shape of that cost. She turned back to her notes and kept writing. The message came 4 days later. Not from Rourke. From someone else or someone pretending to be someone else. It arrived in an envelope addressed to Elena Hart, care of the Mercer Ranch, brought out on the supply wagon with the week's dry goods, and a letter for Mercer from his banker in Billings. Pruitt handed it to her off the wagon with the rest of the parcels as if it were nothing. She didn't open it in front of anyone. She took it to the kitchen, set it on the table, and looked at it for a moment. Her name and handwriting she didn't recognize. No return address. Postmarked from Billings. She turned the envelope over. The seal was plain wax, no insignia. She opened it. 1 page. Not a long letter, only a few paragraphs. But she read them 3 times before she set it down. The letter told her, in formal and careful language, that a man who wished her well had become aware of her presence at the Mercer property and of her apparent involvement in matters related to Victor Rourke's business dealings. The letter told her that the man she believed to be connected to Rourke had a long memory and a demonstrated willingness to protect his interests by other than legal means. The letter told her that a woman without property, family connections, or legal standing was a fragile thing in the territories, and that her reputation, the only asset a woman in her position truly owned, could be damaged with very little effort by someone who knew how. It was signed, "A friend who does not wish to see you harmed." She sat still for a moment. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it in her apron pocket. She understood the calculus of what she'd been sent. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was careful enough to avoid being that. It was an invitation to consider whether her involvement was worth the risk. A message designed to find the place in her that was afraid and press on it, with just enough pressure to make her think about walking away. She thought about walking away for about 45 seconds. Then she got up and went to find Mercer. She found him at the barn, checking the hooves of a horse that had been coming up lame. He was crouched down with the hoof between his knees, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway, reading something in her face. He let the horse's leg down and stood up. "What is it?" She handed him the letter. He read it standing. His expression did the same thing it always did with anger tightened, went still, the emotion working inward rather than out. "A friend who doesn't wish to see you harmed," he repeated when he'd finished. "Voss," she said. "Or someone working for him who knows I'm here. How would he know? Rourke would have reported back when I was identified as the one who flagged the contract. If Rourke and Voss are connected, Voss would know my name." She paused. "My father's case wasn't obscure. Voss knew who the Hart family was. If he has any kind of system for tracking people who might be obstacles, I might have been on a list somewhere." Mercer looked at the letter again. "He's threatening your reputation. He's reminding me that I don't have much protection." Which is true. She kept her voice level. A fabricated complaint in the right office, a rumor spread to the right people in the right towns. It doesn't take much to make a woman in my position unemployable, and he knows that. Mercer looked at her. "Are you going to back away from this?" She looked back at him steadily. "No. You understand what I'm offering here isn't protection exactly. I can't." He stopped. "I have influence in this county. I can speak to certain things. But I can't stop a rumor once it's moving." "I know." She held out her hand for the letter. He gave it back. "I'm showing this to Vale when he comes Friday. It's evidence of intimidation, regardless of how carefully it's worded." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about how much to give him. She decided on the honest answer because she was tired of the careful one. "Because I have spent 12 years knowing what those men did to my father and being unable to do anything about it. And now I'm standing 20 feet from the same mechanism, and I have an attorney and evidence and the chance to actually stop it." She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. "I'm not walking away from that. I don't care what it costs me." He looked at her with the expression she'd seen on his face a few times now, that particular quiet that happened when something landed differently than he expected. He didn't say anything, and she didn't need him to. She went back to the kitchen. Vale arrived Friday morning with a face that said he'd found something. He found Elena first in the garden, on her knees in the turned soil, checking the early growth. He crouched down beside her without ceremony and said, "I have the corporate records." She sat back on her heels. "And Rourke's entity is registered as a land development trust. The named principals are Rourke, a Helena banker named Morton Seal, and a third party listed as a silent investor." He paused. "The silent investor is registered under a shell entity in Omaha. The shell entity's registered agent is a law firm that, in 1869, filed 3 motions on behalf of a land dispute involving a Nebraska homesteader named Thomas Hart." She was very still. "That's my father's case, yes." She looked at the emerging green shoots in the turned soil. The chives were doing well. The time was establishing itself. Small proofs that what looked dead sometimes wasn't. "The law firm worked for Voss," she said. "I believe so. I haven't confirmed it directly yet, but the connection is there." He looked at her carefully. "Elena, this is more organized than I thought. This isn't a man who developed a scheme. This is an operation that has been running for at least 15 years. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her hands and her knees. "What does that mean legally? It means that if we can fully document the pattern, the affected families, The corporate connections, the matching legal structure. This is not a simple property dispute. This could be a federal fraud matter. She absorbed that. How many families, do you think? I've identified 9 so far who may have been affected by the same scheme across 3 territories. There could be more. He stood as well. Elena, the threatening letter you received, I need you to understand what comes next if we continue this. Voss has been operating for 15 years without anyone successfully challenging him. The reason for that is not just that his contracts are well constructed. It's that witnesses don't hold. She looked at him, meaning they're intimidated into silence, meaning that, yes. She thought about the letter in her apron pocket, not the same apron, but the letter was in the house, in her room, tucked between the pages of the notebook. I received something this week. She told him about it. She watched his face as she described the contents, and she saw the moment he made the connection between the letter and what he was telling her. Do you have it? He asked. I'll get it. She went to the house and came back with the letter and her notebook, and she sat at the kitchen table with Vale across from her, and Mercer standing at the window. She'd sent word to him when Vale arrived, and she laid out every note she'd kept, every observation about the contract, every memory she could extract from what she'd read of the Voss case files years ago in Iowa. Vale wrote. Mercer listened. The coffee went cold and no one noticed. When she finished, Vale looked at what he'd written for a moment. I want to be direct with you, he said, both of you. He glanced at Mercer, then back at her. If this goes where I think it will go, we'll need Elena to testify about the contract structure and about her connection to the Voss case. Rourke's attorneys will use both of those things against her. Her personal history makes her testimony look motivated by revenge. Her lack of formal training makes it easy to dismiss. Then we make sure the documents speak for themselves, Elena said. My testimony explains them. The documents prove them. That's the strategy, Vale agreed. But it depends on finding those corporate records in full and locating witnesses among the affected families willing to come forward. He looked at Mercer, and it depends on you being willing to let this get complicated before it gets resolved. Mercer crossed his arms. It's already complicated. It'll get more so, then it gets more so. He looked at Elena. I said I'd see this through. I meant it. She looked back at him. He wasn't a man who said things he didn't mean. She'd established that in the first 3 days of working for him. It was one of the more useful things she'd learned about him. All right, Vale said, closing his notebook. Here is what happens next. I file the formal objection to the contract Monday. That alerts Rourke that we're not signing and starts the clock. He'll respond probably by trying to discredit the objection or by approaching other ranchers in the area to establish a coalition of signatories that makes it harder for Mercer to stand apart. He looked at Elena, and he'll almost certainly come after you more directly. The letter was the gentle version. She nodded slowly. I know, if rumors start, and they may, even before anything formal, I need you to tell me immediately. Don't let it run. The faster we respond, the less damage it does. Understand? Vale stood and gathered his papers. I'll be back Tuesday. By then, I hope to have made contact with at least 2 of the affected families from the previous cases. He looked at her once more, that recalibrating look again, like he was still adjusting to what she actually was. You should know, Miss Hart, that what you did with that contract, catching it when you did, almost certainly saved this ranch. Whatever happens from here. She looked at the table. She didn't like being told that sort of thing, not because she didn't want to hear it, but because it made her think about what she hadn't been able to do 12 years ago. The gap between those 2 things was still large, and she didn't know what to do with it. Almost isn't finished yet, she said. Vale allowed himself the smallest version of a smile. No, he agreed, it isn't. He went to the hall for his coat and hat. Mercer stayed by the window. When Vale's horse was moving out of the yard, he turned and looked at her. She was already gathering the cups to wash them. When was the last time someone stood behind you? He asked. The question came out quiet, almost careful, like he wasn't sure if he had the right to ask it. She stopped what she was doing. She thought about her answer for a moment. My father did, until he couldn't anymore. That's a long time to go without. Yes, she said his. She went back to the cups. He stayed at the window a little longer. Outside, the Montana sky had cleared overnight into the kind of hard blue that made the distance look deceptively manageable. The way distance always does on clear days on the frontier, like you could just ride at it and get somewhere. Neither of them spoke again before he went back to work. But something had been said, in the way things get said without words, and both of them were aware of it, and neither of them rushed to put it into language, because some things are more true before they're spoken than after. The bread she'd started that morning was ready to come out. She pulled it from the oven and set it on the rack, and stood with her hands wrapped in the cloth, looking at the crust, thinking about what it meant to finally be in a fight you had a chance of winning. It didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would. It felt heavier, more specific, more real. She set the cloth down and went to the window. The yard was quiet. The garden was growing in its slow, determined way. Rourke would come back with his answer by the end of the following week, and when he did, things would start moving faster than she could entirely predict. She was not afraid. She was something more complicated than afraid, and she was learning to work with it the same way she'd learned to work with everything else, by staying at the table when it would have been easier to leave, and by keeping her hands occupied and her mind clear, and by trusting that what she knew was enough, even when the men who held the power wanted her to doubt it. Outside, one of the hands crossed the yard. The horses moved in the corral. The creek ran somewhere past the east fence, through the north pasture, past the access points that a man in Helena was hoping to control before the next dry summer came. He wasn't going to get them. Elena went back to the stove. Vale filed the formal objection on a Monday the way he said he would, and by Wednesday the news had reached town. Elena knew it had reached town because Pruitt told her when he brought the Thursday supply wagon. He didn't say it directly. Pruitt rarely said anything directly, but he mentioned, while unloading flour sacks, that people at the general store had been talking about the Mercer ranch and some contract business, and that the talking had a particular quality to it that suggested someone had been doing some deliberate seeding before the natural spread took hold. "What kind of talking?" she asked. Pruitt set a sack down and looked at her sideways. "The kind where people say they heard something, but when you ask them who told them, they get vague." She thanked him and carried the information inside with the rest of the supplies. She told Mercer that evening. He listened from the doorway while she put things away, and when she finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" The question still surprised her slightly every time. Hired help didn't usually get asked what they wanted to do about anything. "Nothing yet," she said. "Vale needs to know. But responding to rumors we can't see clearly yet is how you make them bigger." He nodded. "I'll be in town Saturday. If someone says something to me directly, I'll know better what we're dealing with." He went to town Saturday. He came back quieter than he'd left. She waited until he came through the kitchen before she asked. He poured coffee, didn't sit, stood at the counter with his back to the window. "Frank Aldous at the feed store told me he'd heard something about a hired woman at my place, having left a previous situation under bad circumstances." His voice was level and controlled, in the way that meant something underneath it was not. He said it carefully. The way men say things they want you to hear but don't want to be responsible for saying. "I told him I didn't know where he'd heard that, but that whoever told him was either mistaken or lying." Elena kept her hands on the bread she was shaping. "How did he take that?" He backed off. "But the fact that he said it at all means it's already moving," she finished. "How many people were in the store?" 4 or 5 Saturday morning, she nodded slowly. The dough was dense under her palms. She pushed into it, turned it, pushed again. "Did anyone else say anything?" "Nothing direct, but I felt it." He set his cup down. "That's the thing about a rumor in a small county. You feel it before you can name it. People look at you a half second too long, or they look away a half second too fast." She knew that feeling precisely. She had lived with a version of it for years, the sensation of being assessed without being addressed, of having your reputation precede you into rooms you hadn't entered yet. "I'll write to Vale tonight," she said. "I already sent a writer to him this afternoon." She looked up from the dough. He met her eyes steadily. She went back to the bread. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer, but she heard him refill his cup and sit down at the table, and for a while they were in the same room doing different things, which had become its own kind of language between them. Over the past weeks, a silence that didn't ask anything of either of them, and therefore asked quite a lot. Vale arrived Tuesday, as he'd promised, but his expression when he came through the door told her that whatever he'd found had added weight to what he was already carrying. He sat at the kitchen table without being invited to, which was new, and he put his saddlebag down and opened it, and began pulling out papers in a way that felt less like an organized attorney, and more like a man who'd been awake too many nights, and was running on the forward momentum of needing to act. "I found 2 of the families," he said, before Mercer had fully come down the hall. "The Calloway family, east of Miles City, and the Pruitt family, who had a small operation near the Yellowstone. Both of them lost water access during the drought 2 summers ago. Both of them signed contracts with language that matches the structure in Rourke's document." Mercer came in and sat down. "Are they willing to talk?" "Mrs. Calloway is. Her husband died last winter. The family believes the stress of losing the water rights contributed, though you can't prove that kind of thing. Her oldest son will come to Helena if it comes to a hearing." Vale paused. "The Pruitts are afraid. They have 3 children and very little left to lose, which makes people either brave or careful, and in their case it made them careful." "I don't blame them." Elena put coffee in front of both men and sat down herself. "What did Mrs. Calloway tell you?" Vale looked at his notes. The man who came to them was not Rourke. It was Harlan Price. "The man I mentioned works out of Rourke's Helena office. He came twice before they signed, which matches Rourke's pattern with Mercer. After they signed, they heard nothing for 14 months. Then came the drought, and then came a man from the managing entity, not Price, a different man again, who explained that under the terms of their agreement, operational management of their creek access had transferred. He set his notes down. Mrs. Calloway said her husband asked to see a lawyer. The lawyer they went to told them the contract was valid. Elena looked at the table. Same thing that happened to my father. Same thing. Vale folded his hands. I've been trying to identify the lawyers in these cases. In the Calloway situation, the attorney who advised them was a man named Burl Fenwick out of Miles City. I looked into Fenwick's practice. He has done paid consultation work for a land trust entity registered in Helena. He paused. The same Helena trust that lists Rourke as a principal. Mercer's chair scraped the floor slightly as he shifted his weight. He had lawyers in place before the contracts were even signed. It appears so. Not in every case I don't have enough data yet. But in at least 2 of the cases I've examined, the family went to a local attorney after things went wrong. And that attorney had a financial connection to the Rourke entity. Elena thought about the retired attorney in Iowa. She thought about the fact that she'd found him by accident by walking past his office every day for 2 weeks until she worked up the nerve to knock on the door and ask if he needed cleaning help. If she'd gone to the wrong attorney, what she'd learned would have been shaped by what someone wanted her to know. The threatening letter I received, she said. Have you shown it to anyone else? Not yet. I want to have it evaluated alongside any other intimidation evidence we find. Vale looked at her. I need to tell you both something I learned in the last few days. I don't want you to hear it from someone else first. The kitchen got very quiet. There's a complaint filed in a county record office in Nebraska, Vale said. It was filed recently within the last month. It names an Elena Hart as having been accused of petty theft from an employer in Crete, Nebraska. The complaint was withdrawn before any formal proceeding, but the record of filing is there. Elena felt the blood move in her face in a way she couldn't entirely control. She kept her hands flat on the table. That's fabricated, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. I believe you, Vale said immediately. But the document exists. Rourke's attorneys will find it if they look, and they will look. And in court, a withdrawn complaint is a complicated thing. It didn't result in a conviction, but the act of filing it puts a question in the room. Mercer's voice came out with a hard edge. How do we counter it? We find out who filed it and when. If the filing date corresponds to the timeline of this case, if it was filed after Elena flagged the contract, that timing is itself evidence. It shows the complaint was manufactured specifically to damage her credibility as a potential witness. Vale looked at her. Do you have any record of your employment in that period? Anyone who can speak to your character and your tenure in Nebraska? She thought. I worked for a family named Schreiber in Crete for 11 months. Geraldine Schreiber, the wife. She's a precise woman. If she's still there, she would remember the exact date I left and why, and it had nothing to do with theft. She paused. I left because her mother-in-law came to live with them, and the position changed. She gave me a written reference. Do you have the reference? In my satchel. I keep them all. Vale exhaled not quite relief, but the sound of a man who had been holding tension in his chest and could let some of it out. Get it for me. I'll have someone locate Mrs. Schreiber and take a statement from her directly. Elena stood and went to her room. Her satchel was where it always was, the leather strap looped around the bedpost. She opened it and went through the folded papers until she found the Schreiber reference, written in Geraldine Schreiber's tight, upright hand on good paper, dated clearly, signed with her full name. She came back to the kitchen and put it on the table in front of Vale. He read it carefully. This is clear and specific. Names the position, the duration, the reason for departure. This is useful. He looked at her. The fabricated complaint is a sign they're escalating. Until now, it's been a letter and a rumor. A false legal record is a different level of commitment. It means they've decided I'm a genuine threat to the case they want to make, Elena said. Yes, it does. She sat back down. She was aware of Mercer watching her from across the table. She didn't look at him because she didn't want to see whatever was on his face right now, not because she feared judgment, but because she was working hard to stay level, and looking at him tended to make that harder. All right, she said, what do we do next? Vale straightened his papers. 3 things at once. I pursue the corporate records. Fully, I have a contact at the Territorial Land Office who owes me a favor and can pull the full filing history of Rourke's entity without alerting anyone connected to Rourke's interests. Second, I reach out to the Nebraska Record Office to determine who filed that complaint, and when the filing clerk's notation will have the date and the name of the filing party. Third, he looked at both of them. I want to move the case forward before Rourke can regroup. Right now we're reacting. I'd rather be the ones forcing the pace. How do you force the pace? Mercer asked. I file a fraud allegation with the territorial court. It's a more aggressive step than the objection I filed last week. It formally puts Rourke on record as a named party in a legal complaint, which means any action he takes from this point forward is subject to scrutiny. Vale paused. It also means he'll know we're serious, which will likely cause him to escalate further. The room was quiet for a moment. File it, Mercer said. Vale looked at Elena. You understand, this is the point where it becomes very difficult to stop. She looked back at him calmly. I understand. The escalation when it came was faster than any of them expected and arrived from a direction they hadn't watched closely enough. It began on a Thursday morning 9 days after Vale filed the fraud allegation, when Elena went to the well and found Billy, the youngest hand, standing near the bunkhouse door with his hat in his hands, turning it around and around in a way that meant something was wrong. Miss Hart, he said. I need to tell you something. She waited. Man came into town 2 days ago, staying at the hotel. Been talking to people at the saloon, mostly buying drinks, getting people comfortable. Billy looked at the ground, then back at her. Last night my cousin Ira was in there, and he heard this man telling a story about a woman working at a ranch outside of town. Said she'd done something dishonest at her last place, stole from the household, then used her looks to get out of it. He swallowed. Said she was doing the same thing here. Elena felt something cold move through her chest. She kept her face even. Did your cousin get a description of this man? Medium height, dark coat, didn't give a name. Ira said he had the manner of someone who talks for a living. Like a salesman. She thought about Price, Harlan Price, Rourke's man, the one who'd come to the Calloway and Pruitt properties. Thank you, Billy. I didn't think you'd done anything wrong, he said quickly. Neither did Ira. But I thought you should know the story was out there. I'm glad you told me. She went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands on the back of a chair. The thing about a story spreading through a saloon was that you couldn't chase it. You could correct it directly for each person who'd heard it, but that was an endless task. And every time you corrected it, you reminded someone it existed. Rumors had their own weather. The more you worked against them in the wrong direction, the stronger they got. She had to think about this carefully. She found Mercer at the barn, as she often did in the mornings, and she told him about Billy's account. She watched him listen. She watched the specific way his jaw tightened at the part about her. Looks not embarrassed exactly, but something that reminded her he was a man who came from a place where that kind of comment about a woman on his property meant something personal to him. Where is this man now, he said. Still in town as far as Billy knows. I'll go in, and do what? She said it without judgment. She wanted to know what he was thinking. He was quiet for a moment. Confront him directly. That makes it a story about a confrontation. Right now it's a rumor. A confrontation is harder to quietly correct afterward. He looked at her. So we do nothing. We don't do nothing. We do something deliberate. She thought it through as she said it. You go into town, but not to confront anyone. You go in for your normal business. You're seen being normal. You speak to the people you know, the ones whose opinion matters to this county, and you're straightforward with them. You tell them you're in a legal matter involving a fraudulent contract, that your attorney is handling it, and that anyone who has questions about the people working on your property is welcome to ask you directly. She paused. You don't mention me by name. You don't make it about me. You make it about the fraud, and the fraud is already known to be real because Vale filed the objection 2 weeks ago. He thought about that. That puts the story in a different frame. It makes the rumor look like what it is, an attempt to muddy a legal case by attacking a witness. People out here understand that kind of move. They may not like legal complications, but they understand when someone's being played. Mercer was quiet for a moment, looking at the horses in the corral. Then he said, "Come with me." She looked at him. "To town." "Yes. That will be noticed, I know." His voice was even and deliberate. "That's the point. If they want to make this about your presence here and your character, then let people see you standing next to me in the main street and come to their own conclusion about what I think of your character." She stood with that for a moment. It was a significant gesture, and they both knew it. A rancher of Mercer's standing riding into town with his hired housekeeper beside him was not nothing. It was, in the language of that territory at that time, a statement. "Are you certain?" she asked. "No," he said, which she appreciated more than a confident yes would have been. "But I think it's right." They rode in the following morning. The ride was 2 hours, mostly quiet in the way that had become natural between them. Not uncomfortable silence, but working silence. Two people who had developed the habit of being in the same space without filling it with noise. The sky was low and gray, the kind of morning that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. They came into Harlan Creek, the county seat, such as it was from the North Road, and Elena felt the particular awareness she always felt when entering a town that might already be talking about her. A kind of readiness, not quite tension, more like the feeling before weather. Mercer went to the land office first, because he had actual business there related to a surveying question on the east parcel. Elena waited outside with the horses. Several people passed on the boardwalk. A A woman she didn't know looked at her once, then looked away. A man tipped his hat without slowing down. When Mercer came out, they walked the horses down to the feed store, and Mercer tied up and went in, and Elena went with him, which was the first visible moment, the cook and housekeeper from the Mercer ranch, in town, next to the man himself. The store had 3 customers. Frank Aldous was behind the counter, the same man who'd spoken to Mercer the previous Saturday. He looked at Elena for exactly as long as it would have been impolite not to, and then looked at Mercer. "Caleb," he said, "Frank, I need to settle the account and put in an order for next week." Mercer set his list on the counter. "This is Miss Elena Hart. She manages my household." Elena looked at Aldous directly. She'd found over the years that hired women who looked directly at people tended to be taken more seriously than those who didn't. She didn't smile with excessive warmth. She didn't perform anything. She just looked at him the way one person looks at another when there's nothing to hide. "Mr. Aldous," she said, "Miss Hart." He held her gaze for a moment, then went to the list. They stayed in the store long enough for it to be natural, and not so long that it became deliberate. When they left, Mercer stopped on the boardwalk to speak to a man he knew, a rancher named Greer, who had the look of someone who'd heard things and wasn't sure what to do with them. Mercer talked about the fraud case openly, in the calm, factual way that Vale had recommended, without naming anyone present at the ranch, but making clear that the contract Rourke had presented had been identified as designed to steal water rights, and that he had an attorney handling a formal complaint. Greer listened. He asked 2 questions. He looked once at Elena, then back at Mercer. "Rourke came to me too," he said after a pause. Mercer went still. Elena felt it from where she stood, a careful stillness. "When?" 3 months ago. "I didn't sign something felt wrong, but I couldn't say what." He rubbed his jaw. "I didn't know you were in the same situation. Have you talked to Vale about it?" "No, you should." Mercer looked at him steadily. "If Rourke came to you with the same contract, Edmund needs to know." Greer looked at the ground and then at the gray sky and then back at Mercer. "All right," he said. "I'll go see him." They rode back to the ranch that afternoon with more than they'd gone in with, and Elena turned over Greer's account the whole ride home. Rourke had approached at least one additional rancher in the county with the same contract. If Vale could get Greer to provide a formal statement, the pattern in this county alone was becoming impossible to dismiss as coincidence. She said as much when they got back and she was unsaddling her horse. Mercer, unsaddling his own beside her, said, "How many do you think there are?" "Ranchers?" he approached. "In this county? Could be 4 or 5. Across the territory?" She looped the stirrup up. "More than that." He was quiet for a moment. Greer said something felt wrong, but he couldn't say what. Most people know when something's wrong before they can name it. The documents are designed to make that instinct hard to trust. She ran a hand along the horse's neck. "That's why men like Rourke are so effective. They don't overcome your judgment. They make you doubt it. You didn't doubt yours." She looked at him over the horse's back. "I had 12 years of practice knowing exactly what to look for." He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she still hadn't entirely learned to read, something that was honest and complicated at the same time, something that she thought might have been closer to admiration than anything else, though she wasn't comfortable naming it that. "That practice cost you a great deal," he said. "Yes," she said. "It did." She picked up the saddle and carried it to the rack and didn't say anything more, and he didn't push it, and they went separately to their respective parts of the house when it was done. Vale came Thursday, and the news he brought changed the shape of everything. He came in fast. His horse was lathered from a hard ride, which was not like him, and he came through the kitchen door instead of the front, which meant he'd cut directly around the house rather than riding up to the porch. Elena was at the stove. She looked at his face and turned the burner down. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He put his saddlebag on the table and opened it and pulled out a folder thick with papers. His hands were not entirely steady. "I have the full corporate records," he said. The land office contact came through. He opened the folder. The Rourke entity, the Land Development Trust, has a parent organization. It's registered in Chicago under a holding company name, and the holding company has 3 named directors. He looked up. One of them is Gideon Voss. The kitchen was silent. "It's him," Elena said. "It's him." Vale laid the registration documents on the table. She could see the names typed clearly: Rourke, a second name she didn't recognize, and then Voss, Gideon A., with an address in Omaha. He's not a silent investor. He's a named director, which means everything Rourke has done in this territory was done as an agent of an organization that Voss co-controls. She looked at the documents. The name on the page was just type on paper, but it had weight, the weight of 12 years and a Nebraska homestead, and her father's hands turning documents over in the lamplight. "This connects everything," Mercer said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. "It does," Vale said. "The Nebraska cases, the Montana cases, the intimidation letter Elena received, all of it links to the same organization." He looked at Elena carefully. This also means that Voss knows you're involved. He would have been told immediately when Rourke reported back after you flagged the contract. I know, and the fabricated complaint in Nebraska. Filed by someone connected to his organization, she said. Yes. Vale pulled another paper from the folder. I got the filing record from Nebraska 2 days ago. The complaint was filed by an agent acting under a power of attorney. The attorney, in fact, is registered to the same Chicago holding company. She stared at him. They filed a false criminal complaint against me through a corporate proxy. Yes. Which is itself a criminal act, if we can prove it was deliberate, and the corporate connection makes that demonstrable. He set the paper down. Elena, this is the evidence we needed. The complaint isn't just a smear on your character. It's a provable act of witness intimidation by an organized entity. Mercer came fully into the kitchen and stood at the end of the table. What do we do with all of this? Vale straightened. Some of the road weariness seemed to leave him, as he shifted into the part of himself that was an attorney with a case. We take it to Helena. I want to present this to Judge Harlan Crow directly, not through correspondence, in person. The evidence of corporate connection, the matching contract structures, the intimidation of a witness through a fabricated complaint, and the testimony of the affected families. He looked at Elena, including yours. She thought about a courtroom. She'd never testified before. She'd read case transcripts for years. She knew what it looked like, but knowing and doing were different animals. When? She asked. I'd like to schedule a preliminary hearing within 3 weeks. That means we need to leave for Helena in 10 days. He looked at both of them. I'm going to ask you both to come. Mercer, as the property owner, was standing in the case. Elena as the primary witness to the contract fraud and the connecting mechanism. Elena looked at the corporate records on the table. Voss's name, the Chicago holding company, the fabricated complaint filed by a corporate proxy, 12 years compressed into a folder of papers on a kitchen table in Montana. What will Rourke do when he knows we're going to Helena? She asked. He likely already knows we're preparing to, Vale said. The fraud allegation I filed is public record. His attorneys have known for days. He paused. I expect he'll try one more time to discredit you before the hearing. He may try to contact other potential witnesses and pressure them not to come forward. He may try to influence people in Helena who have relationships with Judge Crow. Vale looked at her. He'll try everything that doesn't cross into an obviously criminal act, because he's been doing this long enough to know where the line is. And Voss? Vale was quiet for a moment. Voss is more careful. He won't appear directly. But if Rourke fails, Voss has more to lose than Rourke does. His name is on those corporate documents now. We'll be watching. Elena looked at the documents for a long moment. Then she stood up and went to the stove and turned the burner back up, because the soup she'd been making when Vale came in was still sitting there, and it needed attention. She stirred it slowly. She thought about the morning after her father lost the homestead, the way the light had looked, coming through the window of their rented room in the next town. Different light from different glass. Nothing familiar in the angle of it. The whole world suddenly belonging to someone else. She'd been 17 and she hadn't understood yet how to turn what had happened into something that could be used. She understood now. She understood that the documents on the table behind her were worth more than anything she could have done at 17, with nothing but grief and anger. She understood that the case they were building was real in the way legal things had to be real, documented, demonstrable, built from evidence rather than emotion. She also understood, stirring that pot, that she was afraid. Not of Rourke, not exactly of Voss. Afraid in the specific way she always got afraid when something mattered enough that failing it would leave a mark that wouldn't come out. She'd spent 12 years building towards something she couldn't have named, and then she'd walked into a Montana ranch kitchen and found it, and now it was 3 weeks from a courtroom in Helena, and everything depended on her walking in there and saying what she knew. She'd managed fear before. You managed it the same way you manage cold water or a difficult horse or a room full of people who didn't want to hear what you had to say. You kept moving. You didn't stop to feel all of it at once. You stayed in the present moment and put one foot in front of the last one. I'll be ready in 10 days, she said to the soup. Behind her, she heard Vale gathering his papers. She heard Mercer say something to him in a low voice. She heard the particular quiet that meant the two men were in agreement about something and didn't need to discuss it further. She kept stirring. Outside, the gray sky had finally made up its mind, and it was starting to rain, the same indifferent April rain that had greeted her when she arrived, coming down steady and cold across the yard, turning the turned earth of the garden dark, running off the barn roof in thin lines, moving across the Montana flats in the direction of wherever it was going. The ranch around her was as real as anything she'd ever stood in. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and soup, and the particular mineral smell of rain coming through an open window. The bread from the morning was on the rack, cooling. The herb garden was growing. The hands would be in from the pasture by dark, and they'd be hungry, and she'd have food ready. She did not let herself think about Helena yet. Not the courtroom, not Rourke's attorneys, not the careful way fear worked when it got into a room full of witnesses and made them doubt what they knew. She thought about the soup. She thought about the bread. She thought about 10 days, which was enough time to do what needed to be done before the bigger thing had to be faced. One foot in front of the other. She adjusted the flame and turned to set the table. They left for Helena on a Tuesday, 10 days after Vale had spread those corporate records across the kitchen table, and the name Gideon Voss had sat there in black type, like something that had always been waiting to be found. Elena was up before 4 that morning. Not because she hadn't slept, she'd slept. A few hours at least, which was better than she'd expected, but because there were things to arrange before she left. She'd spoken to Hutchins the evening before about the household and the kitchen. She'd written out instructions for the meals in a notebook and left it on the counter where it would be found. She'd checked the garden and left notes about the watering. She did all of this not because she thought it wouldn't be managed without her, but because doing it gave her hands something to do while her mind worked through what was coming. She was at the table with coffee when Mercer came down. He stopped when he saw her, the way he'd done that first week, and then he came to the stove without comment. He poured. He sat at the corner of the table, close enough that they were sitting as two people who'd shared a table for weeks, rather than an employer, and the woman he'd hired to cook. Ready, he said. Not remotely, she said. He almost smiled. Good. I wasn't going to believe you if you said yes. They rode out at 6, Vale joining them on the road from town, and the three of them traveled together through the long Montana morning, with the conversation running in the practical register that serious travel requires horses, road conditions, where to stop for water, what they would do the first day in Helena before the hearing. Elena let the men handle most of that. She was watching the landscape and thinking about what Vale had told her the night before he left the ranch, that Rourke's attorney was a man named Calvin Stroud, who had practiced before Judge Crow twice and lost neither time, and who was known for a particular method of cross-examination that found the place in a witness's account, where confidence and knowledge overlapped imperfectly, and then pressed on that place until something cracked. She thought about imperfect overlaps. She thought about everything she knew and everything she couldn't prove she knew, and the gap between those two things that Stroud was going to try to pry open. She thought about it the way she thought about difficult problems, not anxiously but methodically, turning it over to see all the faces of it. By the time they reached Helena on the second evening, and the lights of the city came up ahead of them in the dusk, she had thought it through enough times that she had stopped being afraid of the specific things and had arrived at a more general kind of readiness, which was the best you could do before a fight you'd never been in before. The hearing was set for Thursday morning, 2 days after they arrived. Vale used those 2 days the way a serious man uses limited time, all of it, none of it wasted. He had arranged for Mrs. Calloway's son, a quiet and solid man named Robert, to come down from Miles City, and Robert was already in Helena when they arrived, staying at the same modest hotel Vale had arranged for all of them. Vale met with Robert for 3 hours the first evening, and with Elena for 2 hours after that, going through her expected testimony in a careful, repetitive way that was not unkind, but was thorough in the way that left no comfortable assumptions intact. He asked her the same questions multiple times, in different orders, with different inflections, and she understood what he was doing, not testing whether she was telling the truth, but testing whether her account was consistent enough under pressure that it would hold when Stroud came at it from unexpected angles. Each time he asked, she answered the same way because the same things had happened, and the facts didn't change based on who was asking or how they framed the question. By the end of the second session, Vale set his pen down and leaned back. "You're going to be all right in there." "Don't tell me that," she said. He looked at her. "Why not?" "Because I'll stop preparing." He allowed himself the small smile she'd come to recognize as his version of genuine warmth. "Fair enough." She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and went through it again in her own head, without Vale, without anyone asking questions, just herself and the sequence of what she knew and how she knew it. She did this until her eyes wouldn't stay open, and then she lay down, and the room was dark, and she slept. The territorial courthouse in Helena was a brick building that smelled of old paper and floor polish, and it was larger inside than it looked from the street. High ceilings, long hallways, the particular quality of echo that courthouses have, sounds arriving slightly delayed, as if the building itself was taking its time deciding what to do with what was said inside it. Judge Harlan Crow's courtroom was on the second floor. They arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled hour. Vale carried his case with the settled purpose of a man on familiar ground. Robert Calloway walked beside him. Mercer walked beside Elena, and she was aware of this in the peripheral way. She was aware of most things about Mercer by now, not consciously attending to it, but registering it the way you register warmth from a nearby fire. She did not look around the room too deliberately when they came in. She'd learned from years of entering rooms where she was being evaluated that looking around too much read as nerves, even when it wasn't. She found the plaintiff's table where Vale directed her, sat down, and looked at the front of the room. Calvin Stroud was already at the defense table. He was a tall man, late 50s, with a head of gray hair kept shorter than was fashionable, and a way of sitting that suggested he was comfortable with the furniture. He was reading something when they came in, and he did not look up, which was itself a kind of statement. Rourke sat beside him, and this was the first time Elena had seen Rourke in person. She had expected someone who looked the part he played, smooth, well-dressed, the confident bearing of a man used to walking into rooms and leaving with what he came for. He was all of that. But he was also, she noticed, thinner than she'd imagined, with a quality around the jaw and eyes of a man who had not been sleeping easily. The confidence was real, but it was being worked for. He looked at her when they came in. She looked back, and she held it for exactly 1 second before looking away, because she wanted him to know she'd seen him, and she wanted him to know it hadn't cost her anything. Judge Crow came in at 9 o'clock exactly, and the room stood and sat with the particular synchronized rustling of people who know the protocol. Crow was a compact, dark-haired man in his mid-50s who wore his authority lightly in the way that genuinely experienced men often do. He didn't announce himself with gesture or volume. He simply sat down, and the room recalibrated around him. He reviewed the matter at hand in clipped, precise language: a fraud allegation regarding a water rights contract, a formal objection to said contract filed by Edmund Vale on behalf of Caleb Mercer, and a companion allegation of witness intimidation involving a fabricated legal complaint filed in Nebraska against a named witness. He looked at both tables and asked if both parties were ready to proceed. Vale said yes. Stroud said yes, with the smooth assurance of a man saying something that costs him nothing. Vale presented first, the way the plaintiff's side did, and he was methodical and clear in the particular way Elena had come to trust over these past weeks. No drama, no oratory, just the facts laid in the order that made them most legible to someone seeing them for the first time. He presented the contract, identified the drought trigger clause, explained in plain terms what it would do and when it would do it. He presented the corporate registration documents showing the parent holding company in Chicago and its 3 named directors, including Voss. He presented the parallel contracts from the Callaway and Pruitt cases with the matching language. He presented the Nebraska complaint and the filing record showing it had been submitted by a corporate proxy registered to the same Chicago entity. Judge Crow listened without expression, which was not indifference. Elena had been watching him for long enough to understand that his stillness was attention, not absence. When Vale finished the documentary presentation, Stroud rose. He did not attack the documents immediately, which was what she'd expected. Instead, he questioned their relevance, each one individually, in sequence, with a patient and almost courteous skepticism that was designed to make the connections Vale had drawn feel like overreach rather than evidence. The matching contract language, Stroud suggested, reflected common industry practice rather than coordinated fraud. The corporate parent was a legitimate investment entity operating in multiple territories. The Nebraska complaint, while withdrawn, had been filed by an individual with authority to do so under applicable statute. He was good, he was very good. Each suggestion he made was narrow enough to seem reasonable on its own, and he moved through them quickly enough that the cumulative effect of reasonable-sounding doubt began to fill the room. Elena watched Judge Crow while Stroud talked. The judge was still attending, making occasional notes, but she thought she saw something in his face, not agreement with Stroud, but a kind of waiting, the expression of a man who knows there's more coming and is reserving judgment until it arrives. Vale called Robert Calloway first. Robert was not a polished witness. He was a ranching man in his 30s who had come a long way to sit in a chair he was uncomfortable in and talk about his family's loss. He was nervous, and it showed. But what he had was specificity. The exact date Price came to their property, the exact language Price had used to describe the water rights arrangement, the exact sequence of events that unfolded during the drought. Specific details, in Elena's experience reading case transcripts, were what juries and judges trusted more than anything else, because invented details tended to be general, and remembered details tended to be oddly precise. Stroud cross-examined him with careful restraint, not aggressive, which would have made Robert sympathetic, but persistent about the limits of his understanding. Mr. Calloway, you've stated you believe the contract language was fraudulent. Do you have formal training in contract law? Robert said no. Do you have any direct evidence that the Rourke entity and the Chicago holding company acted with intent to defraud? as opposed to pursuing a contract that your family found unfavorable after the fact? Robert hesitated and said he knew what happened to his family. Stroud accepted this with a patience that was more damaging than contradiction would have been. When Stroud sat down, Robert Calloway looked across at Elena from the witness chair, and his expression said something that didn't need words, that he'd said everything he could, and he wasn't sure it was enough. Then Vale stood and said, "Your Honor, I call Elena Hart." She walked to the witness chair in the way she'd decided she would walk to it, not slowly, not quickly, not performing either confidence or deference. She sat down. She looked at Vale. He began with the straightforward questions. Her name, her occupation, her current employment at the Mercer Ranch, how she had come to examine the contract Rourke had presented, what she had found. She answered clearly, and she was specific in the way Vale had prepared her to be specific, not general claims, but exact details. Page 8, subsection C. The definition of drought conditions on page 14. The threshold that would trigger the management transfer clause. She gave Crow the language in her own words, and then she gave him the plain meaning of it, and she kept her voice even throughout. Vale moved to the Nebraska history. She described her father's situation concisely, not at length, not emotionally, just the facts in sequence. The contract, the clause, the drought, the loss. She described the years she'd spent studying legal documents afterward. She described recognizing the structure of Rourke's contract on first reading. When you say you recognized it, Vale said, what precisely do you mean? The mechanism is the same, she said. The drought trigger management transfer operates identically. The language used to describe it is different phrasing, different placement in the document, but the function is the same. If you understand what the Nebraska contract did to my father's property, and you read the Rourke contract, you are reading the same scheme. And in your assessment, could this similarity be coincidental? Common industry practice, as defense has suggested? She said. Common practice in legitimate water rights agreements does not involve embedding management transfer provisions in drought condition subsections, using definitional thresholds designed to trigger in moderate rather than severe conditions. A legitimate drought protection clause protects the property holder. This clause transfers control away from the property holder, precisely when they are most vulnerable. The room was quiet after she said it. Then Stroud rose. He was pleasant when he began, which she'd expected. He started with her background established, gently but clearly, that she had no formal legal education, no professional credentials in contract law, no standing as an expert in any recognized field. He was not rude about it. He was almost collegial, as if he regretted having to note these things, and was doing so only because accuracy required it. Miss Hart, he said, settling into his rhythm, you've described reading case files in a law office in Iowa over a period of years. Is that correct?
Yes.
Informally, without supervision or formal instruction. With the permission of the attorney whose office it was. Yes. And the conclusions you've drawn about the legal structure of the contracts in question, those conclusions are based on that informal study. My conclusions are based on reading the documents, she said. The study tells me where to look. The documents say what they say, regardless of who reads them. Stroud accepted this with a small nod, as if it were a point in his favor rather than hers. You've stated that you recognize the Mercer contract as identical in mechanism to the contract your father signed in Nebraska. You were 17 when your father signed that contract. Yes. How many times did you read your father's contract? Once before he signed it. Multiple times afterward, after we lost the homestead. Afterward. After the events in question, when you were already aware that the outcome had been bad for your family. She saw where he was going. Yes, so your memory of that contract was formed and solidified in the context of a devastating personal loss. Is it possible that your reading of the current contract, the Rourke contract, was influenced by that experience in a way that led you to see similarity where professionals might see standard practice? She had thought about this question. She had thought about it specifically, not because Vale had anticipated Stroud would ask it exactly this way, but because she had asked it of herself over the years, in the honest moments when she reviewed what she thought she knew versus what she could actually demonstrate. It's possible, she said, that a person's past experience shapes how they read a document. But the document doesn't change based on how it's read. She paused. The clause on page 8 transfers operational management of water access to Rourke's entity when a drought condition threshold is met. That is what it does. I didn't give it that meaning. The words give it that meaning. My father's contract did the same thing. The meaning of both documents is in the language, not in my reading of it. Stroud let that settle for a moment. Then, you were described earlier as having a personal connection to events involving an entity related to the defense. Is that accurate? Mr. Voss's organization destroyed my family's homestead. Yes. And you are now a witness in a case that may involve that same entity. Yes. Do you believe a person in that position can be entirely objective? She looked at him directly. I don't believe objectivity is the standard for a witness, Mr. Stroud. Accuracy is. I have described what the documents say and what I know about them. Whether I am personally affected by the outcome of this case doesn't change what the documents say. Something shifted in the room. She couldn't have named exactly what it was, a quality of attention, a slight repositioning of the bodies of the people watching, some collective adjustment. Stroud felt it too, she thought, because he moved to a different line without pressing the objectivity point further. He tried the fabricated complaint next, framing it as a separate matter from the current case, a withdrawn complaint in Nebraska, outside this court's jurisdiction, irrelevant to the contract dispute at hand, he suggested, with careful language that introducing it into the current proceeding was an attempt to generate sympathy rather than evidence. Vail objected. Crow considered it for a moment and then asked Stroud to proceed to his point, which was itself a signal. Stroud moved on. He tried several more angles, the timeline of Elena's arrival at the Mercer Ranch relative to Rourke's visits, the question of whether her identification of the clause had been genuinely spontaneous or coached, the limits of her understanding of territorial water law specifically versus contract law generally. Each time she answered what he asked, not more and not less, and she kept her voice at the same level throughout. He was looking, she understood, for the crack, the place where she'd overstate something, where confidence would get ahead of knowledge, where she'd say more than she could support, and give him the opening to pull the whole account apart at that seam. She didn't give him the crack. Not because her testimony was perfectly constructed, it wasn't. There were things she didn't know, and she said so when he asked them. There were limits to what she could claim, and she acknowledged those limits plainly. But the core of what she knew completely. And when Stroud pressed on those places, she didn't bend. When he finally sat down, the room had a different quality than when he'd started. Vail presented the fabricated complaint evidence in full, following the testimony, the filing record, the date, the corporate proxy, the connection back to the Chicago holding company, and therefore to Voss. He laid it out methodically and asked Judge Crow to consider it not as a separate matter, but as integral to the pattern of conduct that defined the fraud allegation. He then presented one final document that Elena had not known he had, until that moment, a corporate correspondence record, obtained through the Territorial Land Office, showing a communication between the Rourke entity's Helena office and the Chicago holding company, dated 11 days after Elena had first flagged the contract. The communication referenced, in language that did not spell out its meaning but strongly implied it, the need to manage a complication arising from a hired employee at the Mercer property. 11 days. The complaint in Nebraska had been filed 12 days after that communication. The sequence was not subtle. Stroud objected to the communication's admissibility 3 times. Crow overruled him each time with the same brief economy that characterized everything the judge did. The arguments concluded in the late afternoon. Crow did not deliberate long. Elena had the impression, sitting at the plaintiff's table in the thinning light from the courthouse windows, that he had made up his mind before the arguments were finished and was doing the required procedural work of reviewing his notes before speaking. He spoke for 12 minutes. He addressed each element of the fraud allegation in turn. He found the contract language unambiguous in its effect, the drought trigger clause, as Elena had described it, and, as the documents demonstrated, functioned as a concealed transfer mechanism rather than a protective arrangement. He found the pattern of matching language across multiple contracts, combined with the corporate connection to the Chicago holding company, sufficient to establish coordinated intent rather than independent practice. He found the fabricated Nebraska complaint, timed as it was to Elena's testimony, and traceable to the same corporate entity through the proxy record, to constitute demonstrable witness intimidation. He issued an emergency injunction blocking the Rourke entity from taking any action under any existing or pending water rights contracts in the territory pending full investigation. He referred the matter for criminal investigation on 2 counts, organized fraud and witness intimidation. He looked at both tables when he was finished and said that any attempt to impede the investigation or contact witnesses outside proper legal channels would be treated as contempt. Then he left. The room exhaled. Elena sat still for a moment. Vail was already standing, already organizing his papers, already the efficient attorney with the next task in his mind. Robert Calloway had his hat in his hands and was looking at the front of the room, with an expression she understood, the particular look of a person who has just watched something they stopped believing would happen actually happen. She felt Mercer beside her before she heard him. He'd come from the gallery when Crow left. He sat down in the chair next to her at the table, not Vail's chair, but the empty one beside her, and he put his hands flat on the table, the way a man does when he needs a moment to feel something solid. It worked, he said. It came out quiet, almost wondering, the voice of a man who had been holding the possibility of failure alongside the preparation for it, and was now finding the ground shifting. Not finished yet, she said. The injunction was real. The referral was real. But Rourke was still out there, and Voss was still out there, and the investigation was only starting. No, he agreed. But today worked. She looked at the front of the room. The bench was empty. The late light came through the high windows at an angle that made the dust in the air visible, moving slowly in the warmth. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he'd looked at legal documents toward the end of his life with a kind of exhausted distrust, as if the language in them was a personal affront, as if the words had made up their minds to be against him. She had never been able to give him back what was taken. She understood she still couldn't, but she had done something with what taking it had left her, and it had mattered today in a room where things were decided, and that was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. She became aware that her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear. She didn't think it was fear, more from the release of something that had been held at a particular tension for a long time, and was now marginally allowed to loosen. She put them flat on the table the way Mercer had and felt the solid wood under her palms. What happens to the other families, she said. The ones who already signed. Vale, overhearing from across the table, answered. The injunction covers existing contracts. They'll be reviewed as part of the investigation. If the fraud finding holds, and I believe it will, those families will have standing to recover what was taken. She absorbed that. All of them? We won't know the full number until the investigation runs. But the mechanism is there. She thought about the Calloway family's water rights restored. The Pruitts, careful and frightened with 3 children. The families whose names she didn't know, yet scattered across the territory, who had signed something that looked like protection and discovered too late that it was the opposite. She thought about how much she didn't know when she was 17, sitting in a rented room looking at the wrong angle of light through unfamiliar glass. She thought about the retired attorney in Iowa and his files, and how she'd walked past his door for 2 weeks before knocking, and how he'd said yes, and how that yes had led here. Robert, she said. He looked up from across the table. Your family's going to be all right. He looked at her for a moment. His jaw worked slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he's managing something. I know you don't know that for certain, he said. No, she said. But I know what the judge just said, and I know what we brought in here today, and I believe it. She paused. That's the best I can honestly offer. He nodded. He looked back at the front of the room. It's enough, he said. They ate that evening at a small restaurant near the hotel, the 4 of them. Vale and Robert Calloway and Mercer and Elena, and the meal was not celebratory in the obvious way, but had a different quality from the careful, tense meals of the preceding days. People ate like people who had been holding themselves together for a sustained period and were now allowed to let the musculature relax slightly. Vale drank a second glass of wine. Robert talked about his mother, about how she'd kept the farm going after his father died, about the specific things she'd lost, not the land or the water rights in the abstract, but the kitchen garden she'd built over 20 years, the particular corner of the property where she'd planted the things she cared most about, the daily routine of a woman who knew her land and had been separated from it. Lena listened to this and thought about her own mother, who had died years before the Nebraska homestead was lost, and had therefore been spared the specific grief of that loss, which was perhaps a mercy, and perhaps not perhaps, it would have been better to have her mother there, wrong angle of light and all, than to face it with only her father's incomprehension and her own 17-year-old fury. She didn't say any of this at the table. Some things you don't say at dinner. Mercer sat across from her and ate his meal with the same deliberate attention he gave most things, and periodically she felt his eyes on her face without looking up to confirm it, and she let that be what it was without deciding what it meant. Later in the hotel corridor outside her room, he stopped and said, "What you did in there today?" She waited. He seemed to be looking for words that were accurate, the way he answered him Stroud. When he pushed, "He's good at what he does," she said. "You were better." She looked at the wall for a moment. "I knew the documents. That's all." "That's not all," he said quietly. "You know that." She looked at him. He was standing close enough in the narrow corridor that she could see the tiredness in his face, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent weeks carrying the weight of his ranch's future and was now feeling the first fractional release of that weight. He looked more human in that moment than he usually allowed himself to look, less managed. "You said when you hired me that you needed someone to manage the house," she said. "I did, and that's what I am, what I've been doing." He looked at her steadily. Among other things, she held his gaze for a moment. She thought about what she wanted to say, and what was accurate, and what was too much for a hotel corridor on the night of a long day. She thought about 12 years of being hired help, and how you learn in that situation to be careful about the spaces between things. "Good night, Mr. Mercer," she said. Something in his face shifted, not disappointment, not exactly. More like a man who had said what he meant to say and was willing to let it be enough for now. "Good night, Miss Hart," he said. She went into her room and closed the door and stood in the dark for a moment. Outside in Helena, the city was doing what cities do at night, the sounds of it coming through the window. The movement of people and horses, and the ordinary machinery of a place that had no idea what had been decided in one of its courtrooms today. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about the injunction, the referral, the corporate records with Voss's name on them, now in the hands of people with the authority to do something about it. She thought about the crack Stroud had been looking for and hadn't found, and she thought about why he hadn't found it, which was simply that the truth was where she'd left it in the documents, in the facts, in the sequence of events exactly as they'd happened. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about the sound of him turning those papers over, the soft, repeated sound of it in the lamp light, looking for the angle that would make the words mean something different. She had found the angle. It had taken her 12 years, but she had found it. And today she had said it in a room where someone with authority had listened, and tomorrow the work would continue. She lay down without undressing and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of what had happened in that courtroom. It was heavier than triumph. It was more complicated than relief. It was the feeling of something that had been pointed in one direction for a very long time finally landing where it was aimed, with all the strange disorientation that comes when something you've carried stops being a weight you're holding and becomes a thing that's been set down. She let herself feel it. Then she closed her eyes and the sounds of the city came through the window, and she slept. They rode back from Helena on a Friday, and the sky the whole way was the kind of clear that comes after a long stretch of unsettled weather, hard blue from horizon to horizon, the light falling at an angle that made everything look more defined than usual, edges sharp, distances readable. Elena rode most of it without talking, which Vale and Mercer had both learned by now was not withdrawal but processing the way she went quiet when something significant had happened and she was turning it over, examining it from each face before she put it away. Mercer rode beside her. Vale took a slightly different line on the road, giving them space without making it obvious he was doing so, which Elena appreciated without acknowledging. By the time the Mercer ranch came into view around the long bend in the road, the main house, the barn, the corrals, the kitchen garden that she'd planted 6 weeks ago now, visibly establishing itself along the south fence, she had done most of the turning over, and was arriving at something like a settled position. The ranch looked different to her than it had the first time she'd seen it through the rain, not because it had changed much physically, though the porch shutter was fixed now, and the warped boards had been replaced, and the garden was green, where before it had been a rectangle of dead stalks and mud. It looked different because she was different in relation to it. She had arrived here as someone passing through, as she'd passed through every household before this one, and somewhere in the weeks of bread and soup and legal documents and early mornings and long silences, and a specific man's hands holding a coffee cup like he'd forgotten what stillness felt like, the nature of her relationship to this place had quietly changed, without her authorizing it. She noticed this and did not know what to do with it, so she unsaddled her horse and went to check the kitchen. Hutchins had kept things running in her absence with the competent low-key efficiency that seemed to characterize everything he did. The kitchen was in order. The bread bin had been replenished by one of the hands' wives who'd helped out before. The garden had been watered. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the familiar arrangement of things, her arrangement, the order she'd imposed on this room in the first days, and felt absurdly the sting of something she didn't have an immediate word for. She put water on and started thinking about supper. Mercer came in 20 minutes later. He'd unsaddled and spoken to Hutchins and done whatever it was he did when returning to the ranch after an absence, the small rituals of reestablishing a man's relationship to his own property. He came to the kitchen doorway and stopped in the way he'd stopped that very first morning, looking at her at the stove, and she looked back at him. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee's almost ready." He sat. He looked like a man who had put down something heavy and was figuring out what his arms were for now. She brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from him, not at the corner the way she usually did, but directly across, which was different enough that they were both aware of it. "Vale is going to send word when the investigation formally starts," she said. "He expects within 2 weeks, I know. He told me on the road." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Rourke's attorneys filed an emergency motion to stay the injunction this morning. Vale told me before we left the hotel." Mercer's jaw tightened. "Will it hold?" "Vale thinks so. The documentation is too complete for a stay to get traction. But it'll take a few days to confirm." She paused. "It's what you do when you're losing. You file motions that slow things down and hope something breaks in your favor in the meantime. He looked at the table. Voss. He'll be harder to reach than Rourke. He's had 15 years of practice keeping his name one step back from the visible work. She thought about the corporate documents, his name typed among the directors of the Chicago holding company, with the same orderly appearance as any legitimate business. But he's named now. The investigation has his name. That's different from before. How different? She thought about how to answer that accurately. It means he's not invisible anymore. Until now, he operated through layers: the holding company, the entities like Rourke, the local attorneys who were on his side of things. Those layers gave him distance. But the distance is documented now. The investigation can follow it. She paused. He'll know that. Men like Voss have very good information. He'll know the investigation started the moment the referral was issued. And what does a man like that do when he knows? He tries to control what the investigation finds and how fast it finds it. He calls in favors. He moves money around. He makes himself look like a distant investor with no operational knowledge of what his business partners were doing. She looked at Mercer steadily. But it's harder to do all of that cleanly when you're doing it in response to an active investigation rather than in advance of one. He's reacting now. He wasn't expecting to have to. Mercer held her gaze. Because of you. She shook her head. Because of the documents. I just read them. Elena. He said her name the way he'd only recently started saying it. Without the miss. Without the formal distance. And it landed differently without those things attached to it. Stop doing that. She looked at him. Stop reducing it to the documents, he said. You read them because you spent 12 years learning how to read them. And you spent 12 years learning how to read them because of what happened to your family. And you came to this ranch and you read mine before I would have thought to be suspicious of them. And none of the rest of this follows without that. He paused. Give yourself that much. She looked at her cup for a moment. The coffee was going cool, but neither of them moved to do anything about it. My father gave me that much, she said finally. He spent his whole life believing that knowledge was the thing that protected people. He just didn't have enough of it himself, and by the time he understood what he'd signed, the knowledge didn't help him anymore. She looked up. I've been carrying that for 12 years like it was his debt I owed him. Like if I could just find the right place to use what I'd learned, it would settle something. Did it? She thought about the courtroom, about Crow's voice reading the injunction, about Robert Calloway's jaw working as he tried not to show what it meant to him. Some of it, she said. Not all of it. I don't think it works like a debt you can pay off completely. But yes, some of it settled. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the hands crossed the yard, and the sound of the evening barn routine came through the window horses, the clatter of a feed bucket, the low voices of men at the end of their workday. What do you want to do now? He said. It was the question she hadn't let herself sit with yet, because the days leading up to Helena had been about one thing, and during that one thing there hadn't been room for anything else. Now there was room, and the question had a different weight than it did when he'd asked versions of it before. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I need a few days before I know. He nodded, and the conversation shifted into the practical matters of supper and the next day's work. And she was grateful for that shift in the way you're grateful for solid ground after a long crossing. The investigation moved faster than Vale had predicted. Within 10 days of the Helena hearing, a federal investigator named Archer arrived in the territory with a letter of authorization from the circuit court in a manner that suggested he had done this kind of work before and had no patience for the parts of it that were theater. He interviewed Vale first, then Mercer, then Elena separately. Methodically, the same careful, repetitive approach Vale had used to prepare her, but with a different quality to it, the quality of someone who was building a case rather than reinforcing one. He asked her things Vale hadn't asked. He wanted to know about the retired attorney in Iowa, his name, his practice, whether he'd had any connection to Voss's operations that she knew of. He wanted to know about specific language in the Nebraska contracts, which she'd written from memory in the notes she kept, and he compared what she'd written to documents he had with him, and she watched his face change slightly when they matched. He asked her whether she'd ever been contacted by Gideon Voss directly. She said no. He asked whether she had reason to believe Voss knew her by name before the Mercer case. She said she believed so, based on the threatening letter and the fabricated complaint, but that she couldn't prove it directly. He wrote everything down in a small notebook with the same precision Vale used, small, careful handwriting. And when he was finished, he said that she'd been very helpful and that someone from his office would be in touch with any further questions. She asked him whether he thought Voss would be charged. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating look of a man who is choosing between accuracy and discretion. He chose accuracy. The corporate records and the Nebraska complaint are strong evidence, Whether we can build a criminal case depends on what we find in the holding company's internal documents and whether any of Rourke's associates are willing to cooperate. He paused. Rourke himself has not been cooperative. Will he be? Eventually, Archer said, with a flatness that told her he'd seen this before and knew how it went. When the alternative becomes clear enough. Rourke broke 6 weeks later. Vale sent word by Ryder, which was the fastest communication available, and Elena read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, with Mercer standing in the doorway. She read it twice, then looked up. Rourke accepted a cooperation agreement, she said. He's provided a full account of the operation in exchange for a reduced charge. Voss is named explicitly. The Chicago Holding Company's full document record has been subpoenaed. Mercer let out a breath that was not quite a sound, more a controlled release of something he'd been holding at steady pressure. He came to the table and sat down. She handed him the letter. He read it. Voss, he said when he finished. Archer's office has enough now to arrest him. Vale says it could be within the week. She kept her voice even when she said it, because the alternative was to feel the size of it, and she wasn't ready yet to feel the full size of it. She'd been managing it in pieces for so long, the document, the corporate records, the courtroom, the investigation, that the cumulative weight of what it all meant hadn't been allowed to land at once. She stood up and went to the window. The kitchen garden was full June green now, the rosemary and thyme dense and fragrant, the beans climbing the poles she and Billy had put in 3 weeks ago, the chives thick along the south border. She'd planted all of it in soil that had been dead for 4 years, and it had come back because that was what growing things do when someone takes care of them. He'll fight it, she said. Voss, he has resources and he'll use all of them. Yes, Mercer agreed. But he can't fight it the same way when his name is in the public record. It changes what it costs him. He was quiet for a moment. Vale said something else in that letter. Did you read the last paragraph? She had. She turned from the window. The Nebraska homestead. There's a restitution process for properties lost in fraud cases connected to Voss's operation. Vale had written it carefully, with his usual precision, that a formal process existed, that Elena's family's case from 12 years ago fell within the scope of what was being investigated, and that if she chose to pursue it, he could assist her in filing the appropriate claim. She had read it twice and then moved past it because she hadn't known what to do with it yet. What will you do? Mercer asked. She looked at the garden. The money wouldn't buy back the homestead. The land's been sold twice since my father lost it. The actual property is gone. She paused, but the money is real. What would you use it for? She had been turning this over since she read the paragraph the first time, the way she turned everything over systematically, looking at each face of it. The answer had started forming before she was ready to say it out loud. There were other families. Not just mine, not just the ones Vale found for the Helena case. If this operation has been running for 15 years, there are people across 3 territories who signed the same contract and lost everything, and never had anyone explain to them what happened or why. She looked at Mercer. They need someone who can read those documents and who understands how the scheme works. They need it before they sign things, not after. She paused. Vale knows a young attorney in Helena, a woman named Charlotte Price, no relation to Rourke's man. She's been practicing 2 years, and she's good. He mentioned her last month when we were talking about what happens after the case closes. Mercer was looking at her steadily. You want to set up something permanent. A legal fund, small offices rotating wherever the need is. People could bring documents before signing. Someone would read them and explain them in plain language. She stopped. It would take the restitution and more. I don't have more. I do, Mercer said. She looked at him. I was about to sign a contract that would have destroyed this ranch, he said. That has a value. What you did has a value that I can assign a number to, even if the number is imprecise. He held her gaze. Let me fund it with you. She stood at the window for a moment, feeling the familiar pull toward the careful answer, the hired help answer, the answer that kept appropriate distance between what she needed and what she would accept. She pushed past it. All right, she said. Gideon Voss was arrested on a Thursday in late June at his offices in Omaha. The arrest was reported in the territorial papers within a week, and Vale sent the clipping with a letter that said only, "It is done. More to follow." Evie Elena read the clipping at breakfast, alone in the kitchen in the early morning the way she'd been reading things for 12 years. She read it once. She set it down. She looked at it for a long moment, the name, the charge, the word arrested printed in the matter-of-fact type of a newspaper that covered an arrest the same way it covered a cattle auction or a county election, because events had their proper categories, and this one had finally found its correct one. She felt something she would have difficulty naming precisely even to herself. Not triumph, because triumph was too clean for something this complicated. Not closure, because closure implied a completeness that didn't account for her father's last 12 years of working other men's fields, or the families who hadn't recovered yet, or the ones who might never. It was something more like the feeling of a knot that has been worked at for a very long time finally releasing its last fiber, the relief less joyful than physical, the body's response to a sustained tension ending. She picked the clipping up again and folded it carefully and put it in her notebook, between 2 pages near the back, where she kept the things she needed to hold on to. Then she made coffee and started the bread. The 2 families who had already lost water rights under Rourke's contracts had their rights formally restored in August, through a process that was neither fast nor simple, but that Vale navigated with the same deliberate patience he applied to everything. The Calloway family's water access was the first to be formally reinstated, and Robert sent a letter that was not long. He wasn't a man who wrote at length, but that said clearly that his mother had gone back to the corner of the property where she'd kept her kitchen garden and had started replanting it. Elena read this at the kitchen table and did not examine her own reaction too carefully, because it was the kind of thing that, if you examined it, required you to feel its full size, and her full size was considerable. She wrote back to Robert. She told him about the legal fund. She told him that if his family or any family they knew needed someone to look at documents before signing, there would be people available to do that at no charge, and that the work had already begun. Charlotte Price had come down from Helena in July, a small, serious woman with efficient hands, and the specific energy of someone who had spent 2 years doing good work and waiting for the opportunity to do more of it. Elena sat with her for 3 days, going through everything she knew, the mechanisms, the language patterns, the specific clauses to look for, and the specific ways they were disguised. Charlotte asked sharp questions and took precise notes, and looked at Elena at the end of the 3rd day, with the expression of someone who has just understood the full scale of what they've been handed. "You should have been an attorney," Charlotte said. "I didn't have the means," Elena said. "You had everything else." Elena looked at her. "That's why we're doing this. So the means isn't the only thing that matters." Charlotte nodded slowly, the nod of a person committing to something. "I'll need an office in Miles City as well as Helena. Billings eventually. Vale is working on the Miles City arrangement. Billings by spring." Charlotte looked at her notes. 17 families connected to the Voss operation who haven't been contacted yet, at minimum. Archer's investigation will likely surface more. "I'll start with the families Vale has already identified." Charlotte closed her notebook. "Miss Hart, Elena, what you've built here matters. I want you to know I understand what it is." Elena looked at the table. She was not comfortable receiving. This kind of acknowledgement had never been comfortable with it, perhaps because hired help learned early to exist below the register of being acknowledged. "Just do the work," she said. "That's what matters." Charlotte smiled at this, not dismissively, but with genuine warmth. "Yes," she said, "that's what matters." The question of what Elena was going to do now had been sitting in the background of everything since Helena, and Mercer had not pressed it, which she appreciated, because she was not a person who responded well to pressure on things she was still working through. She was still the cook and housekeeper. The kitchen was still hers. The garden was still growing. The hands still came in at dark, and there was still food ready when they did. This had not changed. What had changed was harder to name. She was aware of it in the way you become aware of something that has been developing gradually, not a single moment of recognition, but an accumulation of smaller ones. The way Mercer stopped in the kitchen doorway in the mornings, and they talked before the day started, and the conversations were not about the ranch or the legal case, but about everything else, what she'd read, what he was thinking about, the things that interested them that had nothing to do with water rights or fraud schemes, the way he'd stopped being formal about the small things without making a point of the change, the way she'd noticed, sometime in late June, that she'd stopped thinking of herself as temporary. She did not examine this too directly, because there were things that looked different under direct examination than they did in peripheral vision. It was Hutchins who named it, in his oblique way. She was at the garden one Saturday in late August, staking the last of the bean plants, and Hutchins came by on his way from the equipment shed and stopped and looked at what she'd done with the space, the organized beds, the thriving herbs, the winter vegetables already establishing, and said, "Boss doesn't look at this property the same way he did in March." She kept staking. "What do you mean?" "He looks at it like a person looks at something they're planning to keep." He chewed for a moment. "Hadn't done that in a while, before you came." She didn't say anything. "I've worked for Caleb Mercer for 9 years, Hutchins said. "I know what he looks like when he's going through the motions, and I know what he looks like when something has his attention." He looked at the garden. "He's had his attention for some months now." He moved on without elaborating, because Hutchins was a man who said exactly as much as was necessary, and then stopped. She finished staking the beans. It was Mercer who finally said it, on an evening in September when the light was going early, and the air had the first edge of the coming cold. They were on the porch after supper. She'd started sitting on the porch in the evenings when the weather allowed it, and Mercer had started joining her, and this had become another of the unmarked routines that had accumulated between them, without either of them deciding to make it one. He was looking out at the darkening land and she was reading, and it was the kind of quiet that had long since stopped needing to be filled. He said, without looking at her, "I ended the arrangement with Miss Alderton." She looked up from her book. Clara Alderton, the woman from St. Louis he'd agreed to marry before Elena arrived, the arranged engagement that had been in the background of everything without being discussed. She had come briefly to the ranch in June, a visit that Elena had managed to be largely absent from, and then departed, and the matter had not been raised since. When, she said, 3 weeks ago, I wrote to her family directly, he was still looking at the land. It was an arrangement that made sense at one point. It didn't make sense anymore, and I wasn't willing to go through with it for the wrong reasons. She closed her book. How did her family take it? Formally, they were not. It wasn't a love match. The arrangements will be untangled without difficulty. He paused. I should have ended it sooner. I kept not doing it because I didn't want to make another decision while everything else was in motion. That was a coward's reasoning. She looked at him. He used that word, coward, the way some men used it, as a precise self-assessment rather than self-flagellation. She respected the distinction. You're not a coward, she said. I was on that particular thing. He finally looked at her. I wanted to tell you directly. Not in passing, she held his gaze. The porch was cooling as the light went, and somewhere across the north pasture a coyote started, and then stopped, the sound hanging briefly in the air and then gone. Why, she said. It was not a challenging question. She wanted to know what he would say. He looked at her steadily, and this time there was nothing managed about his expression, none of the controlled flatness he used in the world, none of the containment. He just looked at her the way a person looks at another person when they have decided to stop being careful about it. Because you deserve to know where things stand, he said, and because I am not a man who does things indirectly if he can do them directly. He paused. You have built something here that matters to people I don't even know. You have run my house and my kitchen and my legal affairs with more competence than I had any right to expect from any arrangement. You have done things in these past months that I would not have believed possible if I hadn't watched them happen. Another pause, shorter, and I am aware that all of that is separate from what I'm trying to say, which is that I would like you to stay. Not as the woman I hired, as the woman I want here. She looked at the darkening land for a moment. She thought about hired help distance. She thought about 12 years of careful answers. She thought about what it had cost to maintain careful answers and what it cost not to. I'm not easy to be with, she said. I'm stubborn about most things. I disappear into my head for days when I'm working through something. I have strong opinions about how a kitchen should be managed, and I'm unlikely to change them. I'm aware, he said. You're not particularly easy either, she said. You're too self-contained. You hold things in until they've done damage. You don't ask for help when you should. He looked at her for a moment. I know, those are not small things. No, he agreed. They aren't. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and neither of them looked away, and the porch cooled around them, and the first stars were appearing at the edge of the sky, and she thought about the morning she'd arrived through the rain, and the woman she'd been when she arrived, and the woman she was now, and about the distance between those two people that had collapsed somewhere in the past 6 months, without her noticing the exact moment it happened. All right, she said. He was quiet for a moment. All right. Yes. She looked at the stars. All right. She heard something in his breathing change, not dramatically, just the sound of a man allowing himself something he'd been not quite hoping for long enough, that having it required a moment of adjustment. They sat on the porch until the cold finally drove them in. They married in November, in the spare ceremony that the Montana frontier understood veil present, Hutchins in the hands. Robert Calloway and his mother, who had come down from Miles City, and who brought with her a jar of preserves from her kitchen garden that she pressed into Elena's hands without saying anything, because some things were better expressed that way. Charlotte Price was there with her notebook in her coat pocket, because Charlotte was rarely without her notebook, and 2 of the affected families who had gotten their water rights back came because they wanted to, which was the kind of thing that doesn't need to be explained. It was not a smooth or particularly elegant event. The food was good because Elena had made most of it herself that morning, and someone managed to knock over a full pot of cider that had to be cleaned up mid-proceedings, and Hutchins gave a toast that was approximately 4 words long, because Hutchins was not a toasting man, and everyone appreciated the brevity. Elena stood next to Mercer at the front of the room and looked at the people in it, people who had come from different distances and different circumstances and different versions of loss and recovery, and who were standing in a warm room on a cold November day because something had been built that was worth being present for. She thought about her father. She thought about the angle of light through unfamiliar glass in a rented room in a town that didn't belong to them, and she thought about how far that moment was from this one, and about everything that had happened in the distance between them. She thought about what it cost and what it built, and whether those two things balanced. They didn't balance. Loss didn't balance. You didn't trade something taken for something gained and arrive at zero. Her father's last years were his last years, and the homestead was the homestead, and no legal fund or restitution process changed the specific texture of what was lost. But there were 17 families who had been found. There were water rights restored. There was a woman in a Helena office reading contracts that other women and men couldn't read for themselves, and because of that reading, things that would have been taken weren't taken. There was this room on this November day with these people in it. That wasn't a balance. It was something different from a balance. It was what happened when you took the worst thing that ever happened to you and refused to let it be, only that when you looked at it long enough and hard enough to understand its machinery, and then you used that understanding in every situation you could find where it mattered. It didn't give back what was taken. Nothing did. But it made of the taking something other than pure loss. And that was the most honest version of the thing people meant when they talked about things meaning something. That was what it meant. Mercer stood beside her, and she could feel the steadiness of him, not perfect, not easy, a man with his own particular damage and his own particular distance to cross, but present in the way that mattered, which was completely and, with his attention, fully where he'd said he would put it. She had not expected this. She had not expected any of this specific version of things. She had expected to keep moving. She'd been moving for 12 years town to town, household to household, the canvas bag and the leather satchel, and the references folded carefully between pages, always arriving and always knowing she would eventually leave. She'd built a life that was designed for leaving because she'd never found a place worth staying, or because the places worth staying hadn't wanted her to, or some combination of those two things that was too complicated to sort into clean categories. She was staying now, not because the place had earned it, though it had, and not because she was tired of moving, though there was an element of that too. She was staying because she had looked at this ranch and this man, and this particular set of circumstances, and she had made a choice, the way you make real choices, which is with full knowledge of what you're giving up, as well as what you're gaining. She was giving up the particular freedom of a person who owns nothing and can leave anything. That was a real loss. She didn't pretend it wasn't. What she was gaining was harder to name precisely, which was how she'd learned to identify the things that were genuinely worth having, not the ones that were easy to name, but the ones that required you to sit with them for a long time before the right words came. Home was too simple a word for it. Belonging was closer but still not quite right. What it was, she thought, was the experience of having a place in the world that was shaped to your specific dimensions, not a generic place, not a pleasant approximation, but one that knew the particular shape you were and held it correctly. She had been 17 years finding it. That was not too long. That was exactly as long as it took. The winter that followed was the hard kind that Montana specialized in, cold that came in early and didn't negotiate, snow that arrived with seriousness and stayed. The ranch hunkered into the season the way working properties do, the rhythms tightening, the days built around the non-negotiable requirements of animals and fuel and food. The kitchen was warm. It was always warm now, not just in temperature, but in the way rooms are warm when they are being properly used, when someone is paying attention to them, when the things in them are where they belong, and the smells are right, and there is food at the expected times, and the fire is maintained, and small things don't go undone. Mercer came in every morning before the day started, and they sat at the corner of the table and drank coffee in the early light, and talked about whatever was in their heads, which was sometimes practical and sometimes not. He had started to let her see more of what was in his head, the things he'd kept at steady distance, the weight of the years after his wife and child died, the specific way grief had converted itself in him into work and more work, until the work was all there was. He talked about it the same way he talked about everything, steadily, without embellishment, with the precision of a man reporting accurately on his own experience. She listened. She told him her own versions of the same kind of thing in return. It was not easy, and it was not always comfortable, but it was honest, and honest was the standard she'd held everything to for 12 years, because it was the only standard that had ever meant anything. The ranch hands treated her differently now, which she'd expected, not worse, but differently, with a slightly adjusted kind of respect that acknowledged she was no longer the housekeeper and had become something more complex in the architecture of the place. Billy, the youngest, started bringing her things he found that he thought she might find interesting: a hawk feather, a piece of unusual quartz, a small carved wooden figure someone had left in the bunkhouse, which was his version of affection, and she accepted it as such. Hutchins treated her exactly the same, which was the highest compliment he was capable of giving. In February, Vale sent a final letter on the Voss matter. Voss had entered a plea agreement. The charges organized fraud across 3 territories, conspiracy, and the specific charge related to the fabricated complaint against Elena resulted in a sentence that would keep him from operating in any land or water capacity for the remainder of his legal freedom, and his legal freedom was expected to be substantially curtailed. The Chicago Holding Company was dissolved by court order. The remaining assets were directed, in part, toward restitution for the affected families. The final count of families connected to the scheme was 23. 17 of them had been fully identified during the investigation. The remaining 6 were found through the work of Charlotte's office, which had expanded by then to include a second attorney and a clerk in Miles City, who could read maps and property records, and who had, according to Charlotte's letter, a gift for finding things that had been deliberately made hard to find. Elena read Vale's letter twice and then filed it in the notebook, behind the newspaper clipping about the arrest, between 2 pages near the back where she kept the things that needed to be held onto. She did not write in the notebook that day, which was unusual. She left it closed on the table and went out to the kitchen garden, which was dormant under the February cold, the soil dark and compressed under a thin skin of frost. She walked the beds slowly, the way she'd walked them that first morning, when she'd found the rosemary still alive, and the thyme pushing through and the chives at the south border. 23 families. She stood in the frozen garden and let herself feel the full size of it, which she'd been not quite allowing herself to do since the whole thing began. She let it land, all of it at once, not managed in pieces. The weight of what had been done, and what had been stopped, and what had been built out of the stopping. Her father's hands on the wrong documents. Robert Calloway's mother replanting her kitchen garden. Charlotte Price in a Helena office reading things that needed to be read. A woman somewhere in the territory who hadn't signed something that would have cost her everything, because someone had read it first. She stood in the cold for a long time. When she went back inside, Mercer was at the table with coffee, and he looked at her face when she came in and he didn't ask any questions, just poured a second cup and set it across from him. She sat down. She looked at her cup. She looked at his hands on the table, large and work-cracked, the hands of a man who built things and kept them. 23, she said. He nodded. He knew what the number meant. It's not enough, she said. There will be more. There are always more. She paused. But it's not nothing. No, he said, it's not nothing. She picked up her cup. The kitchen was warm around them. The garden was dormant outside the window and would be green again in the spring, the way it had been green last springs, the way it would be green every spring that someone tended it. There is a thing that happens to people who survive the worst that was intended for them and then manage to build something real out of the surviving. It is not the triumphant thing that stories often make it. It is quieter and more irregular than that, and it coexists with grief rather than replacing it, and it is never finished in the way you might hope a thing would be finished. But it is real. It has weight and texture, and it occupies space in the world in a way that nothing intended only to take and diminish ever can. Elena Hart had spent 12 years carrying a knowledge that had been given to her by loss, turning it in her hands, looking for the right place to put it down. She had found the place. She had put it to use. And what had grown from the using was 23 families, and a legal fund, and a kitchen garden that came back every spring, and a man across the table whose hands were large and honest, and exactly as present as he'd said they would be. She drank her coffee. Outside, the Montana winter held the land in its particular cold grip, indifferent and absolute. The way the frontier was always indifferent and absolute, it didn't care what you'd been through or what you deserved or how hard you'd worked. It just was what it was, and you built inside it what you could, and you kept the fire going, and you stayed at the table when it would have been easier to leave. The fire in the kitchen never went cold again, and that in the end was enough. Not everything. Not a settling of all accounts. Not the clean resolution that easier stories offered to the people who needed easier stories. Just enough, which, if you were honest about what life actually offered, was the most generous thing it knew how to give.